On a frigid morning in December 1929, a peasant named Ivan from the village of Gadyukino watched party officials nail a new sign to the wall of the local grain depot. Socialist reconstruction begins here. That year, Stalin had declared the Great Turn, ordering every farm to deliver its entire surplus to the state, leaving Ivan's family with nothing but a sack of potatoes for the winter. Within months, millions like him would be dead of starvation, yet in Moscow, planners celebrated the highest industrial growth in history. How could a system that promised to liberate humanity from scarcity produce the most efficient engine of suffering ever devised? The Soviet experiment was a paradox. It built cities in the desert, launched the first satellite, and educated an entire population, while also draining the Aral Sea dry, creating a shadow economy that consumed a third of all goods, and entombing its own citizens in monotowns that would collapse when the state vanished. Today, as nations from China to Venezuela wrestle with central planning, we still do not know. Did the Fiveyear Plan create a new civilization, or a new form of serfdom? This is the story of how a dream of abundance became a machine of ruin, and whether we can escape its ghost. In 1928, the Soviet Union embarked on an experiment without precedent in human history. The first Five-Year Plan was not merely an economic program, it was a declaration of war against the old world. For a decade after the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin's new economic policy, or NEP, had governed the Soviet economy. The NEP was a tactical retreat. It permitted limited private trade, allowed peasants to sell surplus grain on the open market, and tolerated small-scale capitalist enterprise. It was, in Lenin's own phrase, a breathing space for a regime exhausted by civil war and foreign intervention. By the mid-1920s, the NEP had revived agricultural production and stabilized the currency, but it had not built socialism. Private traders, the so-called NEP men, grew rich. Peasants, particularly the more prosperous ones labeled kulaks, resisted state control over grain procurement. The industrial sector, still devastated by war, produced far less than the party needed to modernize the military and the infrastructure of a vast, backward country. The NEP was a compromise, and compromises are fragile things. When Joseph Stalin consolidated his power after Lenin's death, he rejected the NEP as a betrayal of revolutionary principles. The Soviet Union, he argued, could not wait for the slow, organic development of capitalism. It had to industrialize at breakneck speed, or it would be crushed by the capitalist powers. In December 1927, the 15th Party Congress approved the general outlines of a planned economy. By 1928, Stalin had declared the year of the Great Turn. The first five-year plan, formally launched in October 1928, was to run from 1929 to 1933. Its targets were staggering. The official goal was a 250% increase in industrial output and a 150% increase in agricultural output. These figures were not based on careful feasibility studies. They were political statements, designed to demonstrate the superiority of socialism over capitalism. The plan was built on a central premise, that the state could know everything, control everything, and command everything. There was no margin for error. The plan assumed that every factory, every mine, every farm would operate at maximum capacity, every hour of every day. It was a blueprint for a new civilization, a world without markets, without private property, without the chaos of individual choice. The human engine that would drive this transformation was forced collectivization. The party believed that small, independent peasant farms were inefficient and politically unreliable. They could not produce the surplus grain needed to feed the industrial workers and to export for foreign machinery. The solution was to merge these tiny plots into large, state-controlled collective farms, or kolkhozy. By 1930, over 15 million peasant households were driven into these collectives, often at gunpoint. The resistance was fierce. Peasants slaughtered their livestock rather than surrender it. They burned their crops. They attacked party officials. The state responded with terror. The kulaks, a category that expanded to include anyone who resisted, were deported to forced labor camps in the Arctic, Siberia, and Central Asia. Estimates of the number of people deported during the collectivization campaign range from 1.8 to 2.5 million. Many died en route or in the camps. The collectivization drive was not a gradual reform, it was a war against the peasantry. The consequence of this war was catastrophic famine. The most notorious was the Holodomor in Ukraine, which lasted from 1932 to 1933. The word Holodomor means death by hunger in Ukrainian. The famine was not a natural disaster. It was a direct result of state policy. The party requisitioned grain from the countryside at rates that left nothing for the peasants to eat. In 1932, the harvest was poor, but the state's procurement targets remained unchanged. Grain was taken from villages where people were already starving. The state sealed the borders of Ukraine to prevent peasants from fleeing to areas with food. It refused to release grain from state reserves. The result was a death toll of an estimated 3.9 million people in Ukraine alone, with millions more dying in the Volga region, the North Caucasus, and Kazakhstan. The bodies lay unburied in the streets. Cannibalism was reported. The Soviet government denied the famine existed. It continued to export grain abroad, using the foreign currency to buy industrial equipment. The Holodomor was not an accident. It was a calculated act of social engineering, a demonstration that the state would sacrifice millions to achieve its goals. Yet, by the narrowest of metrics, the first 5-year plan succeeded. Industrial output did rise dramatically. Steel production doubled. Coal production tripled. The Soviet Union built entire cities from nothing. Magnitogorsk, a city of steel mills in the Urals, was constructed in just a few years. Its first blast furnace was lit in 1932. The city's population swelled to over 200,000 by the end of the decade. The Dnieper hydroelectric station, the largest in Europe at the time, began generating power in 1932. The Turkestan-Siberia Railway, a 1,000-kilometer line connecting Central Asia to Siberia, was completed in 1930. These were real achievements. They transformed the Soviet Union from an agrarian backwater into an industrial power. By the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union was the second largest industrial producer in the world, after the United States. The cost, however, was staggering. The human cost was measured in millions of lives. The social cost was measured in the destruction of traditional communities, the erosion of trust, and the creation of a system of terror that permeated every aspect of life. The labor conditions in the new industrial cities were horrific. The average industrial laborer worked 12-hour shifts, often 7 days a week. Food rationing was severe. Workers in the most critical industries received slightly better rations, but even they faced constant hunger. Housing was a crisis. In Magnitogorsk, workers lived in tents, dugouts, and barracks with no running water or sanitation. Disease was rampant. Typhus and dysentery were common. The state's response to labor shortages was to impose draconian discipline. In 1932, the government introduced internal passports, effectively tying workers to their jobs. Leaving a job without permission was a criminal offense. In 1940, the penalty for being late to work by more than 20 minutes was imprisonment. The system became a form of industrial serfdom. Workers were not free to choose their employment, their residence, or their lives. They were cogs in a machine that demanded total obedience. The state also relied on forced labor on a massive scale. The Gulag system, which had existed in embryonic form since the early 1920s, expanded explosively during the first 5-year plan. Prisoners, many of them kulaks and political prisoners, were used to build the most ambitious projects. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, completed in 1933, was built almost entirely by Gulag labor. An estimated 25,000 prisoners died during its construction. The Moscow-Volga Canal, the Baikal-Amur mainline railway, and countless mines and factories relied on forced labor. The Gulag was not a marginal institution, it was an integral part of the planned economy. It provided a pool of disposable labor that could be worked to death without any concern for welfare or rights. The system was designed to extract maximum output at minimum cost, and it did so with brutal efficiency. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly to present a different picture. Posters showed smiling workers, their faces lit by the glow of blast furnaces. Newspapers celebrated the Stakhanovite movement, named after Alexei Stakhanov, a coal miner who, in 1935, supposedly mined 102 tons of coal in a single shift, 14 times his quota. The Stakhanovites were held up as heroes of socialist labor. They received bonuses, better housing, and public acclaim. But the reality was more complex. Stakhanov's feat was staged. He was given extra workers, better equipment, and a carefully prepared mine face. The movement created enormous pressure on ordinary workers, who were expected to match these impossible standards. Those who failed were accused of sabotage. The Stakhanovite movement was a tool of social control, a way to divide workers and enforce discipline. The gap between propaganda and reality was already present in the first plan. The posters showed abundance, the workers faced rationing, the newspapers celebrated freedom, the camps held millions. The plan created a new social hierarchy. At the top were the party officials, the factory directors, and the engineers. They had access to special stores with imported goods, better housing, and medical care. Below them were the Stakhanovite workers, a privileged stratum of the working class. But the vast majority of industrial laborers lived in poverty. The housing crisis was so severe that entire families lived in single rooms in communal apartments. The food rationing system was complex and inequitable. Workers in heavy industry received the highest rations, but even these were barely enough to survive. The average calorie intake in 1932-33 was below subsistence level. Malnutrition was widespread. The state's priority was not the welfare of its citizens, it was the fulfillment of the plan. The plan also had a profound psychological impact. It created a culture of fear and suspicion. The state demanded absolute loyalty. Anyone who questioned the plan, who failed to meet targets, or who was suspected of wrecking, could be arrested and sent to the Gulag. The secret police, the OGPU, and later the NKVD, had informants in every factory and every collective farm. The terror was not random, it was systematic. The party purged itself of anyone it considered unreliable. The first show trials of the 1930s targeted engineers and technical experts who were accused of sabotage. These trials were public spectacles, designed to demonstrate that the state was vigilant against internal enemies. The result was a society in which trust was impossible. People learned to say nothing, to suspect everyone, to conform outwardly while hiding their true thoughts. The first 5-year plan did not just transform the economy, it transformed the human soul. The question of whether the first 5-year plan created a new civilization or a new form of serfdom cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. It did both. It created a civilization of steel, concrete, and electricity. It built factories that had never existed, cities that rose from the steppe, and a military that would defeat Nazi Germany. It created a society in which millions of people were literate, educated, and employed. It gave women access to education and employment on a scale unprecedented in Russian history. The Soviet Union of 1933 was a different world from the Soviet Union of 1928. It was more urban, more industrial, more powerful. But it was also a world of terror, famine, and unfreedom. The serfdom of the first 5-year plan was not the serfdom of the Tsars. It was a modern bureaucratic serfdom enforced by passports, labor books, and the secret police. It was a system in which the individual had no rights against the state, in which the state claimed the right to dispose of every life as it saw fit. The central tension of the first 5-year plan was between its stated goals and its actual methods. The goal was a classless society of abundance. The method was state violence on an unprecedented scale. The plan was supposed to liberate humanity from the tyranny of the market. Instead, it subjected humanity to the tyranny of the plan. The market, for all its flaws, allows for individual choice, for adaptation, for error correction. The plan had no feedback mechanism. If a target was unrealistic, it was not revised, it was enforced through terror. If a factory produced shoddy goods, the manager was punished, not the system. The plan was an act of faith, not of reason. It assumed that the state could know enough to direct every economic decision. That assumption was wrong. The information required to run a complex economy is not available to any central authority. The first 5-year plan proved that a command economy can produce rapid growth in certain sectors, but it cannot produce balanced, sustainable development. It can build steel mills, but it cannot produce the right steel in the right quantities for the right purposes. It can mobilize millions of workers, but it cannot motivate them to work efficiently or creatively. The legacy of the first 5-year plan is still with us. It created the template for state-led industrialization that was copied, with variations, by China, India, and other developing countries. It demonstrated that rapid industrialization is possible, but only at a terrible human cost. It showed that the state can override market signals, but only by creating a system of coercion that destroys the very initiative it seeks to harness. The plan was a bet on the future, a wager that the present generation could be sacrificed for the benefit of generations to come. That bet was made without the consent of those who were sacrificed. The millions who died in the famine, the millions who were deported, the millions who worked in the gulag, they were not asked whether they were willing to pay the price. They were told that history demanded it. The first 5-year plan was not a single event. It was a process that continued, in various forms, for decades. The targets of the first plan were not fully met. The official statistics claimed that industrial output increased by a 118%, not the 250% that had been promised. Even this figure is disputed. Many of the new factories produced goods that were of low quality or that nobody wanted. The agricultural sector was devastated. Grain production did not recover to pre-collectivization levels until the 1950s. The livestock population was decimated. The plan created a system that was good at building things, but terrible at maintaining them. The new factories were often inefficient, consuming vast quantities of raw materials and energy. The quality of Soviet industrial goods was notoriously poor. The system rewarded quantity, not quality. A factory manager who met the tonnage target for steel was a hero, even if the steel was brittle and unusable. A tractor factory that produced thousands of tractors was celebrated, even if the tractors broke down after a few months. The plan created an economy of waste. The social consequences were equally profound. The first 5-year plan destroyed the traditional Russian village. The peasantry, which had been the backbone of Russian society for centuries, was shattered. The collectivization drive uprooted millions of people, destroyed family structures, and erased a way of life. The new industrial cities were populated by former peasants who had been torn from their land and thrown into a world of machines, schedules, and barracks. They were not free. They were subject to the discipline of the factory, the surveillance of the state, and the terror of the secret police. The Soviet Union became a society of atomized individuals, bound together not by community or tradition, but by fear and ideology. The plan created a new kind of human being, the Soviet man, who was supposed to be selfless, disciplined, and loyal. In reality, the Soviet man was often cynical, opportunistic, and deeply distrustful. The gap between the official ideology and the lived experience was a source of constant tension. The first 5-year plan also had a profound impact on the environment. The rapid industrialization was carried out with no regard for ecological consequences. Rivers were polluted, forests were cut down, and the air was filled with toxic emissions. The Aral Sea, which would later become a symbol of environmental catastrophe, began its decline during this period as irrigation projects diverted water from the rivers that fed it. The industrial cities of the Urals and Siberia became zones of ecological sacrifice, where the health of the population was secondary to the production of steel and coal. The environmental damage was not an accident, it was a direct result of the plan's priorities. The state was interested in output, not sustainability. The natural world was a resource to be exploited, not a system to be preserved. The first 5-year plan was a radical break from the past, but it also had deep roots in Russian history. The Tsarist state had also pursued rapid industrialization, often with forced labor and state direction. The Trans-Siberian Railway, built in the 1890s, was a massive state project that had transformed the economy. The difference was one of scale and ideology. The Tsarist state had not sought to remake human nature. It had not attempted to eliminate private property or to create a classless society. The Soviet state was more ambitious and more ruthless. It was willing to pay any price for its goals. The first five-year plan was a continuation of the Russian tradition of state-led modernization, but it was also something new, an attempt to create a utopia on Earth using the tools of industrial violence. The plan was also a product of its time. The 1920s and 1930s were a period of economic nationalism and state intervention across the world. The Great Depression had discredited laissez-faire capitalism. Many intellectuals in the West admired the Soviet experiment. They saw it as a rational alternative to the chaos of the market. They did not see the famine, the terror, or the camps. The Soviet Union was a closed society. Foreign visitors were shown model factories and model farms. The reality was hidden. The first five-year plan was a propaganda triumph. It convinced many people, both inside and outside the Soviet Union, that socialism could work. It created a myth that would persist for decades, the myth of the planned economy as a rational, efficient, and humane system. The reality was different. The first five-year plan was not a rational system. It was a system of command and terror. It was not efficient. It was wasteful and destructive. It was not humane. It was brutal and cruel. But it did achieve its primary goal. It transformed the Soviet Union into an industrial power. That transformation came at a terrible price, but it was real. The Soviet Union that emerged from the first five-year plan was a country that could produce tanks, airplanes, and guns. It was a country that could fight and win a world war. It was a country that could launch a satellite into space. The plan created the foundation for Soviet power. It also created the seeds of Soviet decline. The system that was built in the 1930s was rigid, hierarchical, and resistant to change. It could not adapt to the challenges of the post-industrial world. It could not innovate. It could not reform itself. The first five-year plan created a civilization that was powerful but brittle, a civilization that would eventually collapse under its own weight. The question of whether the first five-year plan created a new civilization or a new form of serfdom is not just a historical question. It is a question about the nature of power, progress, and human freedom. The plan was an attempt to use state power to accelerate history. It was a wager that the ends justified the means. That wager was lost. The ends were not achieved, or they were achieved in a distorted form. The new civilization was built on a foundation of serfdom. The serfdom was not the old serfdom of the Tsars, but it was serfdom nonetheless. It was a system in which the individual was subordinated to the state, in which freedom was sacrificed for the promise of abundance. The promise was never fulfilled, the abundance never arrived, the serfdom remained. The first five-year plan was a turning point in human history. It demonstrated the awesome power of the state to reshape society. It also demonstrated the limits of that power. The state could force people to work, but it could not force them to work well. It could build factories, but it could not build a prosperous economy. It could create a new social hierarchy, but it could not create a just society. The plan was a monument to human ambition and human folly. It was a testament to the belief that the world could be remade according to a single blueprint. That belief was a delusion. The world is too complex, too messy, too human to be reduced to a plan. The first five-year plan was an attempt to impose order on chaos. It succeeded in creating a new kind of chaos, a chaos of terror, waste, and suffering. The new civilization it created was a civilization of steel and blood. The new serfdom it created was a serfdom of the soul. The legacy of the first five-year plan is still being debated. Some historians argue that it was a necessary evil, a brutal but effective way to modernize a backward country. Others argue that it was a catastrophe, a crime against humanity that destroyed the lives of millions for no good reason. The truth is somewhere in between. The plan did achieve some of its goals. It did industrialize the Soviet Union. It did create a military that could defeat Nazi Germany. But the cost was so high that it is difficult to argue that the benefits outweighed the costs. The human suffering was immense. The destruction of traditional society was irreversible. The creation of a totalitarian state was a disaster for the people of the Soviet Union and for the world. The first five-year plan was not a simple story of progress or of tragedy. It was a complex, contradictory, and deeply troubling chapter in human history. The plan also raises questions that are still relevant today. Can the state direct economic development without destroying human freedom? Can rapid industrialization be achieved without violence and coercion? Can a planned economy ever be efficient and responsive to human needs? These questions have no easy answers. The Soviet experience suggests that the costs of state-led development are enormous. But it also suggests that the market is not a panacea. The Great Depression showed that capitalism can also produce suffering and waste. The challenge is to find a balance between state direction and individual freedom, between planning and markets, between efficiency and humanity. The first five-year plan was an extreme experiment, a test of the limits of state power. The results of that test are sobering. The first five-year plan was a product of its time, but its echoes can still be heard. The debates about the role of the state in the economy, about the trade-offs between growth and freedom, about the ethics of development, these debates are still with us. The Soviet Union is gone, but the questions it raised remain. The first five-year plan was a warning about the dangers of utopian thinking, about the arrogance of power, about the human cost of grand ambitions. It was also a demonstration of what is possible when a society mobilizes its resources for a common goal. The lesson is not that planning is always wrong, or that markets are always right. The lesson is that any system, whether planned or market-based, must be accountable to the people it serves. The first five-year plan was not accountable. It was a system of command, not of consent. That is why it created a new form of serfdom, not a new civilization. The final judgment on the first five-year plan is still being written. The archives are still being opened. The stories of the victims are still being told. But one thing is clear, the plan was a watershed. It changed the Soviet Union forever. It changed the world forever. It showed what the state could do, for good and for ill. It showed that progress has a price, and that price is sometimes too high. The first five-year plan was a leap into the unknown. It was a gamble with the lives of millions. The gamble paid off in some ways, but it failed in others. The new civilization that was promised never fully arrived. The new serfdom that was created lasted for decades. The question is not whether the plan was a success or a failure. The question is what we can learn from it. The answer is that we must be careful what we wish for. The state can do great things, but it can also do terrible things. The first five-year plan was both a great thing and a terrible thing. It was a monument to human ambition and a graveyard of human hopes. It was a new civilization, and it was a new form of serfdom. It was both, and it was neither. It was the Soviet Union. In 1928, the Soviet Union launched an experiment with no historical precedent, the complete abolition of market exchange. The first five-year plan did not merely regulate or guide the economy, it replaced the price mechanism entirely with a single administrative body, Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. Gosplan was tasked with answering a question that no organization in history had ever attempted: how many tons of steel, pairs of shoes, loaves of bread, and kilometers of railway track would every citizen of a vast, diverse, and largely illiterate country need, and then to order every factory, farm, and mine to produce exactly those amounts. The ambition was breathtaking. The logic seemed impeccable. If the chaos of the market could be eliminated, so too could waste, unemployment, and inequality. Central planning promised abundance by design. What it delivered instead was a paradox that would define the Soviet system for 60 years. The world's second-largest industrial economy, capable of launching satellites and building nuclear arsenals, could not reliably produce a light bulb that worked or a shoe that fit. The chronic shortages that plagued every Soviet citizen from Moscow to Magadan were not a bug in the system. They were its inevitable, logical output. The central problem was not that Gosplan was staffed by incompetence. On the contrary, the planning apparatus attracted some of the most mathematically gifted minds in the country. The problem was structural, rooted in the very nature of the information that planning required. In a market economy, prices serve as a condensed signal of scarcity and demand. If wheat becomes scarce, its price rises, and farmers have an incentive to plant more. If too many shoes are produced, their price falls and factories cut back. The system is decentralized, self-correcting, and, crucially, it requires no single mind to know everything. Central planning attempted to replace this distributed intelligence with a single, centralized calculation. To do so, Gosplan had to collect, process, and reconcile millions of data points, the output of every factory, the inventory of every warehouse, the needs of every construction project, the consumption habits of every region. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. By the 1930s, the planning process involved hundreds of thousands of clerks, filling out forms, sending telegrams, and manually adding columns of figures. The resulting plan was a massive, internally contradictory document that was often obsolete before it was printed. The data on which it was based were already months old, and they were systematically distorted by every level of the bureaucracy. This distortion was not accidental. It was a rational response to the incentives that the planning system created. Consider the position of a factory manager in 1932. His factory had been assigned a production target in tons, or in rubles, or in units. If he met that target, he was a hero. If he exceeded it, he was a superhero. But the reward for success was not stability. It was a higher target next year. This was the ratchet effect, and it was the single most powerful force shaping behavior inside the Soviet economy. A manager who met his target of 10,000 tons of steel in 1932 would be given a target of 12,000 tons in 1933. If he somehow produced 12,000, the target for 1934 would be 15,000. The only way to avoid this relentless upward pressure was to convince Moscow that his factory could not possibly produce more than, say, 9,000 tons. This meant hoarding inputs, labor, raw materials, machine time, and deliberately underreporting capacity. A manager who was honest about his factory's true potential was, in effect, punishing himself and his workers. The rational manager therefore lied. He padded his requests for supplies. He concealed his actual inventory. He produced just enough to meet the plan, but no more, and he hid any surplus for a rainy day. This behavior, repeated across tens of thousands of factories, created a systemic hoarding of resources that was invisible to the planners in Moscow. The economy was simultaneously starved of inputs and glutted with hidden reserves. The ratchet effect was compounded by another perverse incentive, the choice of success indicators. The planners could not measure everything. They had to choose a single metric for each factory: weight, quantity, value in rubles, or some other proxy. The choice of metric determined the factory's behavior. The classic illustration is the nail factory. If the plan was measured in tons of nails, the factory manager had a simple incentive: produce the heaviest nails possible. One giant nail weighing a ton would fulfill the entire plan. If the plan was measured in number of nails, the manager would produce millions of tiny nails, each weighing a fraction of a gram. Neither outcome was useful. The giant nail could not be hammered. The tiny nails were useless for construction. The factory had met its target, but the economy had received nothing of value. This was not a hypothetical. The Soviet press of the 1930s and 1940s is filled with reports of factories producing absurdly heavy metal plates, impossibly thick pipes, and ridiculously small screws, all because the plan measured the wrong thing. The problem was not that the planners were stupid. It was that no single metric could capture the multidimensional reality of what a factory should produce. And the planners, sitting in Moscow, had no way to know whether the nails being produced were useful or not. They only knew the tonnage or the count. The information problem went deeper. The data that reached Moscow were not merely distorted by hoarding and gaming. They were actively falsified. Local officials, under immense pressure to show progress, routinely inflated their output figures. A collective farm might report a harvest of 100,000 bushels of grain when the actual harvest was 60,000. A factory might report that it had produced 5,000 tractors when only 3,000 had rolled off the assembly line. The planners in Moscow, in turn, used these inflated figures to set even higher targets for the following year. This created a feedback loop that economists have called planning from the achieved level. The plan for next year was based on this year's reported output, which was already a lie. The result was a spiral of ever-increasing targets that bore no relation to actual capacity. The system was built on a foundation of systematically distorted information. And because there was no independent mechanism to verify the data, no market prices, no independent auditors, no free press, the planners had no way to correct the distortion. They were flying blind, guided by instruments that were deliberately miscalibrated. The consequences of this information failure were visible in every corner of the Soviet economy. Heavy industry, which was the priority of the plan, did achieve impressive raw output. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union produced more steel, more coal, and more cement than any country except the United States. But these mountains of heavy industrial output were largely disconnected from actual demand. Steel was produced in quantities that exceeded what the economy could absorb. Much of it sat in vast, rusting stockpiles, never to be used. The factories that produced the steel consumed enormous amounts of energy, labor, and raw materials, but the final product was often of poor quality and unsuitable for its intended purpose. The same dynamic applied to machine tools, to chemicals, to construction materials. The plan rewarded quantity, not quality, and not fitness for purpose. The result was a bizarre inversion. The world's second largest industrial base coexisted with chronic shortages of the most basic consumer goods. Bread, soap, shoes, light bulbs, toilet paper, needles, thread, pots, pans, these were perpetually scarce. Citizens queued for hours, sometimes days, for a loaf of bread or a bar of soap. The economy produced vast quantities of things no one wanted, and failed to produce enough of the things everyone needed. This paradox was not a temporary glitch, it was a structural feature of the system. The planners in Moscow were ideologically committed to the primacy of heavy industry. Consumer goods were an afterthought, a residual category to be produced only after the heavy industrial targets were met. But even if the planners had wanted to prioritize consumer goods, they lacked the information to do so effectively. How many pairs of shoes did the population need? The planners had no reliable data on foot sizes, on regional preferences, on the durability of existing shoes, on the rate of wear. They set a target in millions of pairs, and the shoe factories produced millions of pairs, all in the same size, all in the same style, all in the same color. The shoes did not fit, they fell apart quickly, but the plan was met. The same pattern repeated for clothing, for furniture, for household appliances. A refrigerator factory might produce 1 million refrigerators, but they were all the same model, with the same design flaws, and they broke down within a year. There was no feedback loop from consumers to producers. A customer who bought a defective refrigerator could not return it, could not complain, could not choose a different brand. The factory had no incentive to improve quality, because the plan measured only the number of units produced. The result was a consumer goods sector that was simultaneously overproducing and under-delivering. The shortage of consumer goods was not merely an inconvenience, it was a source of profound social tension. The promise of socialism was material abundance. The reality was perpetual scarcity. The gap between the promise and the reality was bridged by two informal institutions that became central to Soviet life, the black market and the culture of Blat. The black market, or cherny rynok, was the illegal trade in goods that were officially unavailable. A factory manager might divert a portion of his output to the black market, selling it for cash or bartering it for other goods. A collective farm chairman might sell grain or meat to private traders rather than to the state. A doctor might demand a bribe for a prescription. The black market was not a marginal phenomenon. By the 1980s, Western economists estimated that the unofficial economy accounted for 20 to 30% of all economic activity in the Soviet Union. It was the only sector of the economy that actually responded to consumer demand. If people wanted jeans, the black market provided them, smuggled from the West, produced in underground workshops, or stolen from state factories. If people wanted records, the black market provided them, bootlegged, copied, or imported. The black market was the system's hidden thermostat, correcting the failures of the plan by allocating goods where they were actually needed. But the black market required connections. This is where Blat came in. Blat was the use of personal networks to obtain goods and services. It was not bribery in the narrow sense. It was a system of reciprocal favors, a social currency that was as important as rubles. To get a good cut of meat, you needed to know the butcher. To get your car repaired, you needed to know a mechanic. To get a decent apartment, you needed to know a housing official. To get your child into a good school, you needed to know a teacher. Blat was a survival skill, and it was practiced by everyone from the lowliest factory worker to the highest party official. The system of Blat was not a sign of moral decay. It was a rational adaptation to a system that could not deliver what it promised. If the official economy could not provide a winter coat, a citizen had to find one through personal connections. The coat might have been produced in a state factory, but it would never reach the store. It would be diverted, through a chain of favors, to someone who knew someone. Blat was the lubricant that kept the creaking machinery of the planned economy from seizing up entirely. The prevalence of Blat and the black market had a corrosive effect on the official ideology. The Soviet state claimed to be building a new society, free from the exploitation of capitalism. Yet the daily experience of every citizen was a struggle to circumvent the state's own rules. The party that preached collective solidarity was, in practice, a system of privileged access. The Nomenklatura, the ruling class of party officials, factory directors, and state bureaucrats, enjoyed access to special stores, closed distribution centers, and foreign goods that were invisible to ordinary citizens. They lived in a world of relative abundance while everyone else queued. This double standard was not a secret. It was an open scandal that fueled cynicism and resentment. The system that had promised to abolish privilege had created a new, more rigid form of it. The gap between the official rhetoric and the lived reality was a source of deep, quiet anger that would eventually contribute to the system's collapse. The paradox of Soviet industrial power and consumer scarcity became more acute over time. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union had achieved a remarkable feat. It had the world's second largest industrial base, measured by gross output. It produced more steel than any country except the United States. It built more tractors, more combine harvesters, more machine tools. It launched the first satellite, the first human into space. These were real achievements, and they were the result of a single-minded focus on heavy industry. But the cost was immense. The steel was used to build tanks and pipelines, not to make cars or washing machines. The tractors were built, but they broke down because spare parts were unavailable. The satellites were launched, but the factories that produced them were surrounded by towns where people lived in communal apartments, without indoor plumbing, and queued for bread. The system had created a civilization of industrial giants and consumer dwarfs. It was a civilization that could build a nuclear submarine, but could not produce a reliable bicycle. The failure to produce consumer goods was not a matter of neglect, it was a matter of structural impossibility. The planning system could not process the information needed to match supply and demand for millions of different consumer items. It could not measure quality, it could not respond to changing tastes, it could not innovate. The system was designed for a world of simple, standardized products: steel, coal, cement, tractors, where quantity was the only metric that mattered. As the economy grew more complex, the planning system became more overwhelmed. The number of products that needed to be planned increased from a few hundred in the 1930s to millions by the 1970s. The planning process became a nightmare of paperwork, delays, and contradictions. The plans grew thicker, the deadlines tighter, the errors more frequent. The system was drowning in its own data. The information problem was compounded by the absence of a price mechanism. In a market economy, prices provide a continuous signal of scarcity. If a good becomes scarce, its price rises, and consumers reduce their consumption while producers increase their output. The system self-corrects. In the Soviet economy, prices were set by the state and were almost never changed. A loaf of bread that cost 20 kopecks in 1950 still cost 20 kopecks in 1980, even though the cost of producing it had risen. This meant that prices conveyed no information about scarcity. A good that was in desperately short supply might have a low price, while a good that was abundant might have a high price. The planners could not use prices to allocate resources efficiently. They had to rely on physical planning, deciding in tons and units what every factory should produce. This was an impossible task for an economy of any complexity. The result was a permanent mismatch between supply and demand. The economy was characterized by what economists called shortages of the first kind and shortages of the second kind. Shortages of the first kind occurred when the planned output of a good was simply less than the demand. This was the case with most consumer goods. Shortages of the second kind occurred when the planned output was sufficient, but the goods could not reach consumers because of bottlenecks in transportation, storage, or distribution. A factory might produce 1 million pairs of shoes, but they would sit in a warehouse because there were no trucks to move them, or because the shoes were the wrong size, or because the store had no space. The result was the same: empty shelves and long queues. The queue became the defining image of the late Soviet economy. Citizens spent hours each day standing in lines, for bread, for milk, for meat, for soap, for anything. The queue was not a sign of poverty in the conventional sense. Soviet citizens had money. The problem was that there was nothing to spend it on. The economy was characterized by forced savings. People accumulated rubles because there was nothing to buy. By the 1980s, the Soviet population had hundreds of billions of rubles in savings, a vast overhang of purchasing power that could not be satisfied. This was a time bomb. When the system finally began to liberalize prices in the late 1980s, the pent-up demand exploded into hyperinflation, wiping out the savings of a generation. The chronic shortages were not an accident of history. They were the logical outcome of a system that attempted to replace the decentralized intelligence of the market with a single, centralized plan. The planners could not know what people wanted. They could not measure quality. They could not respond to change. They created a system of perverse incentives that rewarded hoarding, lying, and the production of useless goods. The result was an economy that was simultaneously overproducing and under-delivering, an industrial giant that could not provide its citizens with a decent pair of shoes. The paradox of Soviet planning was not that it failed. It was that it succeeded in building a second industrial superpower, but at the cost of creating a society that was perpetually hungry for the simplest things. The queues for bread were not a sign of poverty. They were a sign of a system that had solved the problem of production, but had failed to solve the problem of allocation. And that failure was built into the very structure of the plan. The central question of this chapter is not whether privilege existed in the Soviet Union. It is whether the system that claimed to abolish class actually created a new, more rigid hierarchy. The answer lies in the Nomenklatura, a term that describes not merely a social elite, but a mechanism of power. The Nomenklatura was the list of key positions in the party, state, and economy that were filled by appointment from above. This was not a secret. The system was codified in party documents with 3 levels: the main nomenklatura, the accounting control nomenklatura, and the organizational accounting nomenklatura. Each level corresponded to a tier of authority. To be on the list was to hold a position that could only be filled by approval from the Central Committee or its regional branches. By the 1930s, the nomenklatura had become the skeleton of the Soviet state. It was the mechanism through which the party controlled every lever of power. The origins of the nomenklatura lie in the early years of Bolshevik rule. After the revolution of 1917, the new regime faced the practical problem of staffing a vast state apparatus. Lenin's solution was to create a system of appointments that ensured loyalty to the party. The term itself, nomenklatura, was borrowed from the Latin word for a list of names. But in the Soviet context, it took on a specific meaning. It was not simply a list of jobs, It was a list of people who could be trusted to execute party policy without question. By the late 1920s, as Stalin consolidated power, the Nomenklatura became the instrument of his personal rule. Those who opposed him were purged. Those who complied were promoted. The Great Purge of 1937-1938 was not a random bloodbath. It was a systematic reorganization of the Nomenklatura. Stalin eliminated tens of thousands of officials, many of them old Bolsheviks, and replaced them with younger, more pliable cadres. By 1939, the Nomenklatura was not just a list of positions, it was a class of people whose survival depended on absolute loyalty to Stalin. The class character of the Nomenklatura became visible in the 1930s, even as official ideology proclaimed the abolition of class. The Soviet Constitution of 1936 declared that the USSR was a socialist state of workers and peasants. But the reality was different. Party officials began to enjoy privileges that were invisible to ordinary citizens. They had access to special clinics, known as Kremlyovka, where doctors provided care unavailable to the general population. They could shop at closed distribution stores, Zakrytai Raspredolite Li, where imported goods, fresh food and consumer items were available at subsidized prices. They were allocated dachas, country houses, for vacation, often in exclusive settlements guarded by security. By the 1950s, these privileges had become institutionalized. The Nomenklatura was not a secret cabal, it was a visible, functioning hierarchy. The system of privileges was codified in party regulations. Officials at each rank were entitled to specific benefits, a certain size of apartment, a certain model of car, a certain number of servants. The hierarchy was precise. A regional party secretary had different privileges than a factory director, who had different privileges than a minister. The system mirrored the formal hierarchy of the state, but it was more rigid. Once a person entered the Nomenklatura, they could be demoted or purged, but they could not leave voluntarily. The system bound them to the party with privileges that could be revoked at any moment. The Nomenklatura's exclusive access to goods was not merely a matter of personal comfort, it was a mechanism of control. The party used privilege to ensure loyalty. A factory director who met production targets was rewarded with a better apartment, a car, or a vacation at a party resort. A manager who failed was punished not just by demotion, but by the loss of these privileges. The system created a direct link between performance and reward, but the performance was defined by the plan, not by the market. The result was a class of officials whose primary concern was not innovation or efficiency, but survival within the hierarchy. They learned to manipulate the system, to hoard inputs, to falsify reports, to meet targets by any means necessary. The Nomenklatura was not a meritocracy. It was a system that rewarded loyalty, not competence. A factory director who met targets through brute force, by driving workers to exhaustion, by ignoring safety, by cutting corners, was promoted. An innovative manager who questioned the plan, who suggested alternative methods, who asked for more autonomy, was purged. The system selected for conformity, not creativity. The evidence for this is clear in the career patterns of Soviet officials. Consider the case of Alexei Kosygin, who served as premier from 1964 to 1980. Kosygin was a competent administrator, but he survived by never challenging the fundamental structure of the Nomenklatura. His 1965 economic reforms, which introduced limited market mechanisms, were watered down and abandoned when they threatened the privileges of the party elite. Or consider the case of Nikita Khrushchev, who attempted to reform the system in the 1950s. Khrushchev tried to reduce the power of the central ministries and to give more autonomy to local officials. He also tried to limit the privileges of the Nomenklatura, for example, by restricting the use of state dachas. The response was swift and decisive. In 1964, the Nomenklatura removed Khrushchev in a palace coup. The plotters, led by Leonid Brezhnev, understood that Khrushchev's reforms threatened their power. Brezhnev promised stability, and stability meant preserving the privileges of the elite. The Brezhnev era, from 1964 to 1982, was the golden age of the Nomenklatura. Under Brezhnev, the system of privileges became more elaborate and more entrenched. The Nomenklatura's access to goods expanded. special clinics were upgraded. Closed distribution stores were stocked with Western imports, foreign cars, electronics, clothing, furniture. The party built exclusive vacation resorts in Crimea, the Caucasus, and the Baltic republics. Officials could send their children to elite schools and universities where they were guaranteed admission regardless of merit. The system became hereditary in practice, if not in law. Children of the Nomenklatura were groomed for positions in the party, the state, and the economy. They attended the same schools, married into the same families, and inherited the same privileges. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had a distinct ruling class, with its own culture, its own values, and its own interests. Corruption became systemic during the Brezhnev era. Officials took bribes to allocate resources, to falsify reports, to grant favors. The black market flourished, and much of it was run by party officials themselves. The most famous example was the cotton scandal in Uzbekistan, which came to light in the 1980s. Officials in the Uzbek Communist Party had been falsifying cotton production figures for years, pocketing billions of rubles in state subsidies. The scale of the fraud was staggering, an estimated 20 billion rubles, equivalent to billions of dollars. The investigation, led by the Soviet Prosecutor General, uncovered a network of bribery that extended from local farm directors to the Central Committee in Moscow. The scandal was not an aberration. It was a symptom of a system in which the Nomenklatura had become a self-serving elite. The party no longer believed in its own ideology. It believed in power and privilege. The Nomenklatura's interest in preserving the system was a key reason why economic reforms failed. The 1965 Kosygin reforms, which introduced limited market mechanisms, were opposed by the party bureaucracy. The reforms would have given factory managers more autonomy, which would have reduced the power of the central ministries. The ministries, staffed by nomenklatura officials, resisted. They watered down the reforms, delayed implementation, and eventually abandoned them. The same pattern repeated in the 1970s and 1980s. Every attempt to introduce market mechanisms, whether in agriculture, industry, or trade, was blocked by officials who feared losing their privileges. The nomenklatura had no interest in a system that would reward competence over loyalty, innovation over conformity. They preferred the stagnation they knew to the uncertainty of reform. The paradox was profound. The system that claimed to be building a classless society had created a more rigid class hierarchy than most capitalist countries. In the United States, social mobility was limited but possible. A child born into poverty could, through education and hard work, rise to the middle class or even the elite. In the Soviet Union, social mobility was almost non-existent for those outside the nomenklatura. The children of workers and peasants could attend university, but they faced discrimination in hiring and promotion. The children of the nomenklatura had guaranteed access to the best schools, the best jobs, and the best privileges. The class structure was not based on wealth. The nomenklatura did not own property in the capitalist sense, but on power. The nomenklatura controlled the state, the economy, and the means of coercion. They could allocate resources, grant privileges, and punish dissent. The class hierarchy was enforced not by the market, but by the party. The nomenklatura's loyalty was to the system, not to ideology. This became clear in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The nomenklatura did not defend the Communist Party or the socialist state. Instead, they converted their party power into private wealth. The process was called nomenklatura privatization. Officials who had controlled state enterprises, natural resources, and state assets simply transferred them into private hands, their own hands. The result was the emergence of a new capitalist class, the oligarchs, who were often the same people who had run the Soviet economy. The transition was not a revolution from below, it was a coup from above. The nomenklatura did not lose power, they changed its form. The consequences of this transformation are still visible today. In Russia, the post-Soviet elite is dominated by former party officials, KGB officers, and their children. The system of privilege has been updated. Instead of dakas and closed distribution stores, there are luxury apartments in London, private jets, and offshore accounts. but the underlying structure remains the same. A small elite controls the state and the economy, and the vast majority of citizens are excluded from power. The nomenklatura did not disappear in 1991, it adapted. The rise of the nomenklatura was not an accident. It was a logical consequence of the Soviet system. The command economy required a central planning apparatus, which required a bureaucracy to implement the plans. That bureaucracy needed to be staffed by loyal cadres, who needed to be rewarded for their loyalty. The rewards took the form of privileges, which created a class with a stake in the system. The class then used its power to preserve its privileges, which meant opposing any reform that threatened them. The result was a vicious cycle. The system produced a class that prevented the system from changing, which led to stagnation, which led to collapse. The historical record is clear. The nomenklatura was not a deviation from Soviet socialism, it was its fulfillment. The system created a new ruling class, and that class ruled in its own interest. The ideology of classlessness was a fiction. The reality was a hierarchy as rigid as any in history. Consider the specific case of the closed distribution stores. These were not secret. They were known to every Soviet citizen. The stores were located in restricted areas, often behind unmarked doors, and they sold goods that were unavailable to the general public. In Moscow, the most famous was the store at the Central Committee building on Staraya Square. Officials could buy imported food, Western clothing, electronics, and furniture at prices far below the black market. The stores were stocked by a separate supply system, the Upravlenie Delami, which bypassed the official distribution network. The system was efficient. Officials never faced the shortages that plagued ordinary citizens. They did not queue for bread or meat or soap. They did not worry about finding a doctor or a school for their children. They lived in a parallel economy, invisible to the vast majority of the population. The same pattern applied to housing. The nomenklatura lived in elite apartment buildings, often with separate entrances, better construction, and larger rooms. They had access to state dachas in exclusive settlements, such as the Rubliovka district outside Moscow. The dachas were not owned by the officials, they were allocated by the party. But the allocation was permanent, and the dachas could be passed down to children. By the 1970s, the nomenklatura had created a network of exclusive communities, with their own shops, schools, and clinics. The rest of the population lived in cramped apartments, often with multiple families sharing a single kitchen and bathroom. The contrast was not hidden, it was visible to anyone who looked. The nomenklatura's control over the economy extended to every sector. The factory director, the collective farm chairman, the minister, the party secretary, all were part of the same network. They met regularly at party conferences, at official receptions, at vacation resorts. They knew each other, they traded favors, and they protected each other. The system was not corrupt in the sense of individual greed, it was corrupt in the sense of institutionalized privilege. The nomenklatura was not a group of thieves, it was a class of rulers. The evidence for this analysis comes from multiple sources. The archives of the Communist Party, opened after 1991, reveal the detailed records of the nomenklatura system. The lists of positions, the rules for appointment, the records of privileges, all were preserved. The memoirs of former officials, such as Mikhail Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, and Andrei Sakharov, describe the system from the inside. Yeltsin, who was a regional party secretary in Sverdlovsk, wrote about the privileges he enjoyed and the way they isolated him from ordinary life. Sakharov, the physicist and dissident, condemned the nomenklatura as a new class that had betrayed the ideals of the revolution. The sociologist Milovan Djilas, a former Yugoslav communist official, wrote the classic analysis of the new class in his 1957 book, The New Class. Djilas argued that the communist parties of the Soviet bloc had created a new ruling class, based not on ownership of property, but on control of the state. The nomenklatura was the embodiment of this class. Djilas's analysis was controversial at the time, but it has been confirmed by subsequent research. The Soviet Union was not a classless society, it was a society with a new form of class stratification. The nomenklatura's resistance to reform was not simply a matter of self-interest, it was also a matter of ideology. The Nomenklatura believed in the system that had given them power. They saw themselves as the vanguard of the proletariat, the bearers of historical truth. They believed that their privileges were justified by their role in building socialism. They did not see themselves as a class, they saw themselves as the embodiment of the party. This ideological self-justification made them resistant to criticism. Any attack on their privileges was an attack on the party, on socialism, on the revolution itself. The result was a closed system of thought, impervious to evidence. The nomenklatura's grip on power was reinforced by the structure of the Soviet state. The party controlled the military, the police, the courts, and the media. Dissent was suppressed. Critics were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The nomenklatura could not be removed by popular vote or by legal challenge. They could only be removed by another faction within the party, which meant by another group of nomenklatura officials. The system was self-perpetuating. The consequences for the Soviet economy were devastating. The nomenklatura's focus on loyalty over competence meant that the most innovative people were purged, while the most conformist were promoted. The result was a decline in the quality of management. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy was run by bureaucrats who had no experience of innovation, no understanding of markets, and no incentive to change. The system could not adapt to new technologies, new methods, or new challenges. The computer gap, the energy crisis, the environmental disaster, all were symptoms of a system that had lost the capacity to learn. The nomenklatura's resistance to reform also had political consequences. The failure of the Kosygin reforms in the 1960s, the stagnation of the Brezhnev era, and the paralysis of the Gorbachev era were all rooted in the same problem. The nomenklatura would not tolerate reforms that threatened their power. Gorbachev's Perestroika, which began in 1985, was an attempt to reform the system from within. Gorbachev tried to introduce market mechanisms, to reduce the power of the central ministries, and to encourage political openness. But the nomenklatura resisted. The reforms were watered down, delayed, and sabotaged. By 1991, the system was in crisis. The nomenklatura, faced with the collapse of the state, chose to save themselves. They abandoned the Communist Party and embraced capitalism. They did not defend socialism, they defended their privileges. The nomenklatura's transformation from party officials to capitalist oligarchs was not a spontaneous process. It was a calculated strategy. The architects of the transition, such as Yegor Gaidar and Anatoly Chubais, worked with the nomenklatura to ensure that the privatization of state assets would benefit the existing elite. The result was a transfer of wealth on a massive scale. The state enterprises were sold at below market prices to insiders. The natural resources, oil, gas, metals, were allocated to former party officials. The banking system was captured by the same network. By the mid-1990s, a small group of oligarchs controlled the Russian economy. Many of them had been members of the nomenklatura. The legacy of the nomenklatura is still visible in post-Soviet societies. In Russia, the political system is dominated by a small elite, many of whom are former KGB officers or party officials. The economy is characterized by high inequality, weak institutions, and widespread corruption. The rule of law is subordinate to the interests of the elite. The same pattern is visible in other post-Soviet states such as Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. The nomenklatura did not disappear, it adapted to the new environment. The historical lesson is clear. The Soviet system created a new form of class stratification, based on control of the state rather than ownership of property. The nomenklatura was not a deviation from socialism, it was its logical outcome. The system that claimed to abolish class actually created a more rigid hierarchy, one that was resistant to reform and ultimately self-destructive. The nomenklatura's loyalty was to the system, not to ideology. When the system collapsed, they simply converted their power into wealth. The class that was supposed to be the vanguard of the proletariat became the vanguard of the oligarchy. The central question of this chapter, who benefited from the system, has a clear answer. The nomenklatura benefited. They gained power, privilege, and wealth. The rest of the population bore the costs, the shortages, the pollution, the repression, the stagnation. The system was not built for the workers, it was built for the rulers. The ideology of classlessness was a mask for a new form of class rule. The evidence for this conclusion is overwhelming. The archives, the memoirs, the economic data, the sociological studies all point to the same conclusion. The Nomenklatura was a self-perpetuating ruling class, and it was the primary beneficiary of the Soviet system. The system could not reform itself because the class that benefited from it had no interest in change. The result was stagnation, collapse, and a transition that benefited the same elite. The story of the Nomenklatura is not a footnote in Soviet history, it is the central narrative. The rise of this new class explains the trajectory of the Soviet Union, from its revolutionary origins to its authoritarian maturity to its chaotic end. It explains why the system could not innovate, why it could not reform, why it could not survive. The Nomenklatura was both the engine and the brake of the Soviet system. It drove the industrialization of the 1930s, but it also prevented the adaptation that was necessary for survival. It was the source of the system's initial strength and its ultimate weakness. The final irony is that the Nomenklatura's victory was Pyrrhic. They survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, but they lost the ideological justification for their power. They became oligarchs, but they also became the objects of popular contempt. The Russian people, who had suffered under the Nomenklatura, now suffer under the oligarchs. The system has changed, but the elite has not. The Nomenklatura has been reborn as the oligarchy, and the cycle of privilege and stagnation continues. The lesson for the present is clear. Any system that concentrates power in a self-perpetuating elite will eventually stagnate and collapse. The Nomenklatura was not unique to the Soviet Union. Similar dynamics can be observed in other authoritarian systems, in corporate hierarchies, in political parties. The temptation to create a closed elite, to reward loyalty over competence, to resist reform, these are universal human tendencies. The Soviet experience is a warning. The Nomenklatura was not an accident of history, it was a result of choices. Those choices led to a system that was both powerful and fragile, both ambitious and doomed. The chapter ends with a question that cannot be answered with certainty. Could the Soviet system have been different? Could the Nomenklatura have been prevented? The historical record suggests that the answer is no. The system was designed to concentrate power, and the concentration of power created a class that would not give it up. The Nomenklatura was not a bug, it was a feature. The system that claimed to abolish class created a new class, and that class ruled until the system collapsed. The rest is history. The central question of this chapter is not whether the Soviet Union had the intellectual capacity to build a computer. It did. The question is, why a system that could launch the first satellite, design the first nuclear power plant, and produce some of the most sophisticated mathematics of the 20th century could not, in the end, build a personal computer? The answer is not a story of individual failure. It is a story of structural impossibility. The Soviet command economy, for all its triumphs in heavy industry and military hardware, was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of iterative, decentralized, user-driven innovation that the computer revolution demanded. And that incompatibility was not a minor flaw, it was a fatal one. The Soviet Union's computer pioneers were world-class. Andrei Kolmogorov, the mathematician who laid the foundations of probability theory and algorithmic complexity, was also a pioneer of cybernetics. Sergei Sobolev, a mathematician and physicist, was among the first to recognize the potential of computing for scientific calculation. And in Kiev, a team led by Sergei Lebedev built the MESM, the Malaya Elektronaya Shetnaya Mashina, or Small Electronic Computing Machine, in 1950. The MESM was one of the first stored program computers in continental Europe. It could perform about 3,000 operations per second. That was comparable to early British and American machines. The Soviet Union was not behind. It was, for a brief moment, at the frontier, but the frontier did not last. The MESM was a one-off. It was built in a laboratory for a single purpose, solving differential equations for the Soviet nuclear weapons program. There was no plan to commercialize it, no plan to mass produce it, no plan to put it in the hands of engineers, managers, or ordinary citizens. The machine was a tool for a closed elite. And that was the pattern. The Soviet Union built brilliant, bespoke computers for military and scientific use, the BESM series, the Strela, the Ural, but it never built a computer industry. The difference is crucial. A computer is a device. A computer industry is a system of design, manufacturing, distribution, and support. The Soviet Union had the first. It never built the second. The structural problem began with the nature of innovation itself. Innovation is not a linear process. It is not a sequence of research, development, production, and deployment that can be planned from a central desk. Innovation is messy. It requires trial and error. It requires failure. It requires feedback from users who are not part of the design team. It requires the freedom to deviate from a plan when a better idea emerges. The command economy was designed to suppress all of these things. The central plan set targets. It allocated inputs. It rewarded conformity. A factory manager who tried a new production method without approval risked being accused of sabotage. An engineer who proposed a radical redesign risked being labeled a deviationist. The system was built to execute a predetermined vision, not to discover a new one. This was not a problem for steel. Steel is a mature technology. The process for making steel was well understood by the 1930s. The Soviet Union could copy Western techniques, build massive plants, and produce millions of tons. The same was true for tractors, for concrete, for basic machine tools. But computing was not a mature technology. It was evolving rapidly. The transistor replaced the vacuum tube, the integrated circuit replaced the transistor. The microprocessor replaced the integrated circuit. Each generation required new materials, new manufacturing techniques, new design methodologies. And each generation required the kind of rapid, decentralized decision-making that the command economy could not provide. The Soviet microelectronics industry was centered in Zelenograd, a science city founded in 1958 specifically to develop semiconductors. The ambition was real, the talent was real, but the system was not. Every design change required approval from the Ministry of Electronic Industry in Moscow. Every new chip required a new production line, which required a new allocation of resources from Gosplan. The typical delay between a design proposal and production approval was 3 to 5 years. In the West, the same cycle took 18 months. By the time a Soviet chip was approved for production, it was already obsolete. The engineers in Zelenograd knew this. They could see the gap widening, but they could not do anything about it. The plan did not allow for rapid iteration. The result was a series of missed generations. In 1971, Intel released the 4004 microprocessor. It was the first single-chip CPU. It had 2,300 transistors and could perform about 60,000 operations per second. It was not a powerful chip by modern standards, but it was a revolution. It meant that a computer could be small, cheap, and programmable. It meant that a computer could be a personal device. The Soviet Union had no equivalent. The first Soviet microprocessor, the K5080 IK-AT, was a clone of the Intel 8080, which had been released in 1974. The Soviet clone appeared in 1978. By then, Intel had already released the 8286, the 8286, and was working on the 8386. The gap was not closing, it was widening. The personal computer revolution accelerated the divergence. In 1977, Apple released the Apple II. It was a complete system, keyboard, monitor, floppy disk drive, and a basic interpreter, all for about $1,300. It was designed for ordinary people. It was a tool for writing, for accounting, for education, for games. It was a platform for an entire ecosystem of software and peripherals. The Soviet Union had nothing like it. The closest equivalent was the Agat, a clone of the Apple II that began production in 1984. But the Agat was not a commercial product. It was built in small numbers for schools and research institutes. It cost about 4 times the average monthly salary. It had no software ecosystem. It had no network of dealers or repair shops. It was a curiosity, not a tool. The contrast with the West was not just about hardware. It was about the entire structure of the industry. In the United States, the semiconductor industry was concentrated in Silicon Valley, a region defined by a culture of risk-taking, venture capital, and open exchange of ideas. Engineers moved freely between companies. Ideas were shared at conferences and in journals. Failure was not a crime, it was a learning experience. The Soviet Union had none of this. The microelectronics industry was a state monopoly. There was no venture capital. There was no market for shares. There was no way for a startup to form. There was no way for an engineer to leave a state enterprise and start a new one. The system was designed to prevent the very kind of entrepreneurial energy that drove the computer revolution. The consequences were not abstract. By 1985, the Soviet Union had less computing power per capita than Portugal. A country with a per capita GDP roughly half that of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had more scientists and engineers per capita than almost any country in the world. It had a literacy rate of nearly 100%. It had a massive military-industrial complex. And yet, in computing power, it was behind a small, relatively poor European nation. The gap was not just in numbers. It was in capability. Soviet scientists could not run the same simulations as their Western counterparts. Soviet engineers could not design the same complex systems. Soviet managers could not use spreadsheets to optimize production. The entire economy was operating with a handicap that grew worse every year. The military felt the gap most acutely. The Soviet defense establishment had always been the priority. It got the best engineers, the best materials, the best factories. But even the military could not escape the structural constraints. By the 1980s, Soviet weapons systems were increasingly dependent on Western microchips. The Soviet Union could not produce enough advanced chips for its own missiles, aircraft, and radar systems, so it smuggled them. The KGB and the GRU ran elaborate operations to acquire Western semiconductors. They bought them through front companies in Switzerland and Austria. They reverse-engineered them in secret laboratories. They copied designs and tried to replicate manufacturing processes. But the copies were always behind. A chip that was cutting edge in the West in 1980 was not available in the Soviet Union until 1985. By then, the West had moved on. This was not a secret. Soviet military analysts knew the gap was dangerous. In 1982, the Soviet defense minister, Dmitry Ustinov, warned that the United States was developing a new generation of smart weapons, precision-guided munitions that use microprocessors to find and destroy targets. The Soviet Union had nothing comparable. The US. Military smart weapons of the 1990s, the Patriot missiles, the laser-guided bombs, the cruise missiles, were all products of the microprocessor revolution. The Soviet Union could not match them. The gap was not just economic, it was strategic. The system that had built the world's largest army, the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and the world's largest tank fleet could not build a guided missile that could hit a moving target. The inability to innovate was not confined to computing. It was a systemic feature. The same structural problems that crippled the microelectronics industry also crippled biotechnology, telecommunications, and advanced materials. In each case, the pattern was the same. Brilliant scientists made fundamental discoveries. The state funded research institutes. Prototypes were built, but the path from prototype to mass production was blocked. The system could not handle the uncertainty, the iteration, the feedback loops that innovation required. It could build a steel mill. It could not build a silicon foundry. The steel mill analogy is instructive. A steel mill is a large fixed investment. It produces a standardized product. The production process is well understood. The inputs are predictable. The output is measurable. The command economy was good at this. It could plan the construction of a steel mill, allocate the resources, and measure the output in tons. But a silicon foundry is different. It produces a product that changes every few years. The production process is constantly being refined. The inputs, ultra-pure silicon, photomasks, chemical gases must meet exacting specifications. The output is measured not just in quantity but in yield, the percentage of chips that function correctly. Yield is a function of countless small variables: temperature, humidity, dust, vibration. Optimization requires constant experimentation. The command economy could not do this. It could not tolerate the failure rate that experimentation required. It could not reward the engineers who tried new methods and failed. It could not adapt quickly enough. The result was a vicious cycle. The Soviet Union fell behind in computing. That meant it fell behind in the tools needed to design better computers. Western engineers used computer-aided design, CAD, to design the next generation of chips. Soviet engineers did not have the computing power to run CAD software. They had to design chips by hand, using drafting tables and slide rules. This was slower and more error-prone. It meant that even if the system had allowed rapid iteration, the engineers would not have had the tools to do it. The gap was self-reinforcing. By the late 1980s, the Soviet leadership understood the problem. Mikhail Gorbachev had been exposed to Western technology during his visits to the United States and Western Europe. He knew that the Soviet Union was falling behind. He made modernization of the economy a central theme of Perestroika. But the reforms were too little, too late. The system could not be reformed from within. The central planning apparatus, the Nomenklatura, the culture of secrecy and conformity, these were not bugs, they were features. They were the foundation of the system. To change them would have been to dismantle the system itself. The computer gap was not just a failure of technology, it was a failure of the entire model of economic organization. The command economy was designed for a world of stable technologies and predictable demand. That world did not exist after 1970. The computer revolution was the leading edge of a broader shift toward information-based, knowledge-intensive industries. The Soviet Union could not make that shift. It was trapped in the industrial paradigm of the 1930s. It could build massive, centralized, hierarchical systems. It could not build small, decentralized, flexible ones. The consequences were profound. The Soviet Union entered the 1980s as a military superpower. It exited the 1980s as a technological backwater. The gap in computing power was not the only cause of the collapse, but it was a critical one. It meant that the Soviet economy could not generate the productivity gains that the West was achieving. It meant that the Soviet military could not keep pace with the US military's investment in precision-guided weapons. It meant that the Soviet people could not access the information and tools that were transforming daily life in the West. The system had run out of room to grow. It had exhausted the possibilities of the industrial model. And it had no capacity to invent a new one. The story of the Soviet computer gap is not a story of lazy workers or incompetent managers. It is not a story of a few bad decisions. It is a story of a system that was structurally incapable of doing what the computer revolution required. The Soviet Union had the brains, it had the ambition, it had the resources. What it did not have was the ability to let 1,000 flowers bloom. It could not tolerate the chaos, the risk, the failure that innovation demands, and so it fell behind, not by a little, by a generation. The lesson is not just historical, it is structural. The command economy was not a failed experiment in a few sectors. It was a system that worked well for some things and failed catastrophically for others. The key was what kind of thing you were trying to do. If the goal was to build a steel mill, the command economy was effective. If the goal was to build a silicon foundry, it was crippling. The difference was not in the material. It was in the nature of the process. Steel is a mature, stable, predictable technology. Microchips are a rapidly evolving, uncertain, feedback-driven one. The command economy could handle the first. It could not handle the second. This is why the Soviet Union could launch Sputnik, but could not build a personal computer. Sputnik was a one-off. It was a spectacular engineering achievement, but it was a single project, managed by a single team, with a single goal. The personal computer was a platform. It required an entire ecosystem of suppliers, developers, distributors, and users. It required a market. It required feedback loops. It required the ability to fail fast and iterate. The command economy could not provide any of those things. The computer gap was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of a system that prioritized control over creativity, stability over exploration, and conformity over experimentation. The Soviet Union did not fail to innovate because it was stupid. It failed to innovate because innovation was incompatible with the way the system worked. And that incompatibility was not a flaw that could be fixed with a few reforms. It was the system's defining characteristic. The final irony is that the Soviet Union's greatest strength, its ability to mobilize massive resources for a single, centrally directed goal, became its greatest weakness. The same system that built the world's largest nuclear arsenal could not build a computer that a child could use. The same system that put the first man in space could not put a personal computer on every desk. The same system that produced some of the world's finest mathematicians could not produce a spreadsheet. The gap was not in talent, it was in structure, and that structure had consequences. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the computer gap was not just a technological problem. It was a strategic vulnerability. The United States had used its computing advantage to build a new generation of weapons, a new generation of logistics, a new generation of intelligence. The Soviet Union could not match it. The Gulf War of 1991 was a demonstration. The US. Military used precision-guided munitions, real-time satellite imagery, and integrated command and control systems. The Soviet Union watched from the sidelines. It had nothing comparable. The system that had been built to win a war with the West could not even keep up with the pace of technological change. The inability to innovate was the system's fatal flaw. It was not a problem that could be solved by pouring more money into research. It was not a problem that could be solved by copying Western designs. It was a problem that required a fundamental reorganization of the economy. It required decentralized decision-making. It required market signals. It required the freedom to fail. The Soviet Union could not provide any of these things. And so it fell behind, not because it lacked brains, but because it lacked the institutional capacity to turn brains into products. The story of the Soviet computer gap is a cautionary tale for any system that prizes control over creativity. It is a reminder that innovation is not a linear process that can be planned from a central desk. It is a messy, unpredictable human process. It requires the freedom to experiment. It requires the tolerance for failure. It requires the ability to learn from users. The command economy could not do any of these things. And that is why, in the end, it could not build a computer that anyone would want to use. The Soviet Union had the mathematicians, it had the engineers, it had the ambition. What it did not have was a system that could let them work. The computer gap was not a failure of individuals. It was a failure of structure, and that failure was not an accident. It was the logical consequence of a system that had been designed for a different era, for a different technology, for a different world. The computer revolution arrived, and the Soviet system could not adapt. It was not built to adapt, it was built to execute. And execution, no matter how brilliant, is not enough when the world is changing. The gap widened year by year. By 1985, the Soviet Union had less computing power per capita than Portugal. By 1990, the gap was even larger. The Soviet Union could not produce a microprocessor that was competitive with the Intel 386. It could not produce a personal computer that was competitive with the Apple Macintosh. It could not produce a software industry that was competitive with Microsoft. The system had failed, not because it was lazy, not because it was stupid, but because it was rigid. And rigidity is the enemy of innovation. The computer gap was the system's undoing. It was not the only cause of the collapse, but it was a critical one. The Soviet Union could not generate the productivity gains that the West was achieving. It could not keep pace with the military technology of the United States. It could not provide its citizens with the tools that were transforming daily life in the capitalist world. The system had run out of room to grow. It had exhausted the possibilities of the industrial model. And it had no capacity to invent a new one. The lesson is clear. Innovation is not a luxury. It is not a matter of a few extra research grants or a few more engineers. It is a structural requirement. Any system that suppresses the conditions for innovation will eventually fall behind. The Soviet Union fell behind in the 1970s. It never caught up. And the gap was not just technological, it was strategic, it was economic, it was existential. The system that could not build a computer could not survive. The final irony is that the Soviet Union had the potential to lead the computer revolution. It had the mathematics, it had the physics, it had the engineering, it had the ambition. But it did not have the institutional capacity to turn potential into reality. The command economy was a machine for executing plans. It was not a machine for discovering new possibilities. And in a world of rapid technological change, that distinction was fatal. The computer gap was not a failure of Soviet science. It was a failure of Soviet economics. It was a failure of Soviet politics. It was a failure of Soviet culture. It was a failure of the entire system, and it was a failure that could not be reversed. By the time the Soviet leadership understood the problem, it was too late. The gap was too wide. The system was too rigid. The world had moved on, and the Soviet Union was left behind. The story of the Soviet computer gap is a story of what happens when a system designed for one era encounters a technology that demands a different kind of organization. It is a story of structural inertia. It is a story of missed opportunities. It is a story of brilliant minds trapped in a system that could not use them. And it is a story that has lessons for any organization, any industry, any country that faces the challenge of rapid technological change. The lesson is simple. If you want to innovate, you must build a system that allows for failure, for feedback, for decentralization, for risk. If you build a system that suppresses these things, you will fall behind, and you may never catch up. The Soviet Union fell behind in the 1970s. It never caught up. The computer gap was not just a gap in technology. It was a gap in the capacity to adapt, and that gap was the system's fatal flaw. It could build a steel mill. It could not build a silicon foundry. It could launch a satellite. It could not launch a software industry. It could win a war of attrition. It could not win a war of innovation. And in the end, that is why the system failed. Not because it was evil, not because it was inefficient, but because it was rigid. And rigidity is the enemy of the future. The central question of this chapter is not whether industrialization exacted a human cost. Every industrial revolution in history has done so. But whether the specific logic of the Soviet command economy made that cost uniquely avoidable, uniquely severe, and uniquely invisible to those who imposed it. The answer lies not in the statistics of production, impressive as they were, but in the landscapes and bodies that the system treated as disposable inputs. The Aral Sea, the Chernobyl exclusion zone, the nickel-saturated air of Norilsk, the cramped communal apartments of Leningrad, these were not accidents. They were the logical output of a system that measured success in tons of steel and kilowatt-hours of electricity, and measured nothing else. The Aral Sea was, in 1960, the world's fourth largest inland body of water, with a surface area of 68,000 square kilometers. It supported a fishing industry that employed 60,000 people and produced 1/6 of the Soviet Union's entire fish catch. The sea's two feeder rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, carried meltwater from the Pamir Mountains into the basin, maintaining a delicate hydrological balance that had persisted for millennia. Then came the decision, taken in the early 1960s under Nikita Khrushchev and accelerated under Leonid Brezhnev, to transform the Central Asian republics into the Soviet Union's primary cotton producer. The goal was cotton self-sufficiency, a strategic imperative, the planners argued, to reduce dependence on foreign imports. The method was massive irrigation. Canals were dug across the desert, drawing water from the Amu Darya and Sir Darya before it ever reached the sea. The largest of these, the Karakum Canal, was 1,075 kilometers long, the longest irrigation canal in the world. By 1980, it was diverting more than half the Amu Darya's flow. The sea began to shrink. The shoreline receded, not by meters per year, but by kilometers. Fishing villages that had stood on the coast for centuries found themselves stranded in a salt-encrusted desert. The fishing fleet was abandoned, rusting on a dry seabed. By 1990, the Aral Sea had lost 90% of its volume. The water that remained was 3 times saltier than the ocean, incapable of supporting fish. The fishing industry was dead. The 60,000 jobs were gone. The communities that depended on the sea were not relocated. They were simply left to survive in a landscape that had become uninhabitable. The ecological consequences were not confined to the seabed. The exposed lake bed, now a vast plain of salt and agricultural chemicals, became a source of toxic dust storms. Each year, winds carried an estimated 100 million tons of salt, pesticide residues, and fertilizer runoff into the surrounding region. The dust fell on fields, on villages, on the lungs of children. Rates of throat cancer, kidney disease, and respiratory illness in the Aral Sea region soared. Infant mortality in Karakal, Pakistan, the autonomous republic that borders the former sea, reached 60 per 1,000 live births, higher than in any other part of the Soviet Union and comparable to the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The Soviet government, which had created the disaster, did not acknowledge it. Official statistics simply stopped reporting on the region. The plan had called for cotton, and the cotton was produced. The human and environmental cost was not a line item in the state budget. It was not a variable in the central plan. It was, from the perspective of the system, irrelevant. The logic that destroyed the Aral Sea was the same logic that built the RBMK reactor at Chernobyl. The RBMK, Reaktor Bolshoi Moshnosti Kanalny, or high-power channel-type reactor, was a design unique to the Soviet Union. It used graphite as a moderator and water as a coolant, but unlike Western reactors, it had no containment building. The core was housed in a simple steel and concrete structure designed to be cheap and easy to build. The design had known flaws. The most dangerous was a positive void coefficient. If the water in the cooling channels boiled, the reaction would accelerate, not slow down. This was the opposite of what safety demanded. Western engineers had identified this flaw decades earlier and had rejected the RBMK design for precisely this reason. Soviet engineers knew about it too. But the plan called for rapid expansion of nuclear power, and the RBMK was the fastest way to achieve it. Safety was a secondary consideration, a constraint that could be managed or ignored. On April 26, 1986, at 1023 am, engineers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine conducted a test of the reactor's emergency systems. The test had been poorly designed and poorly supervised. The operators disabled multiple safety systems, including the emergency core cooling system and the automatic shutdown mechanisms. They reduced the reactor power to a dangerously low level, where the positive void coefficient became unstable. Then they attempted to restart the reactor. The power surged. The control rods, designed to absorb neutrons and slow the reaction, had graphite tips that initially increased the reaction before the boron could take effect. The surge was catastrophic. The reactor exploded, blowing the 1,000-ton cover plate off the core and releasing a plume of radioactive material that spread across Europe. The immediate death toll was 31, plant workers and firefighters who died from acute radiation syndrome. The long-term toll is still debated, but the most reliable estimates from the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation suggest that several thousand excess cancer deaths will ultimately result from the disaster. The economic cost was staggering. The Soviet Union spent an estimated 18 billion rubles, roughly 2% of its GDP, on containment, cleanup, and resettlement in the first 3 years alone. The disaster was not an accident in the sense of an unforeseeable event. It was the predictable outcome of a system that had systematically subordinated safety to output. The RBMK design had been approved because it was cheap. The test had been conducted because the plant was behind schedule. The safety systems had been disabled because they would have delayed the test. The plan was the only reality. Human life was a resource to be consumed. The Aral Sea and Chernobyl were the most visible catastrophes, but they were not the most representative. The everyday environmental damage of Soviet industrialization was more pervasive and, in some ways, more revealing. The city of Norilsk, located 300 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle in Siberia, was built around the Norilsk nickel mining and smelting complex. The plant produced nickel, copper, and platinum group metals, and it did so with virtually no pollution controls. The smelters released sulfur dioxide and heavy metals into the atmosphere continuously. The result was that the area within a 30-kilometer radius of the plant became a dead zone. Trees did not grow. The soil was saturated with nickel and copper to levels that were toxic to plant life. The snow that fell in winter was black with soot. The air in Norilsk contained concentrations of sulfur dioxide that exceeded World Health Organization safety standards by a factor of 10 on a typical day and by a factor of 50 on bad days. Life expectancy for residents of Norilsk was 10 to 15 years below the national average. Rates of respiratory disease, cancer, and birth defects were among the highest in the Soviet Union. The city's population, which peaked at around 300,000, was effectively a workforce housed in a toxic environment. The system did not count the cost. The plan called for nickel. The nickel was produced. The environment was a free resource to be used and discarded. Magnitogorsk, the steel city built on the eastern slope of the Ural Mountains, was a similar case. The Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works, the largest steel plant in the Soviet Union, produced more than 10 million tons of steel per year at its peak. It also produced an estimated 1.5 million tons of air pollutants annually, more than the entire country of Japan. The city of Magnitogorsk, with a population of 400,000, was located within walking distance of the plant. Residents lived in a permanent haze of smoke and particulate matter. The plant's waste was dumped into the Ural River, which became an industrial sewer. The soil in the surrounding region was contaminated with heavy metals. The health effects were catastrophic. The incidence of respiratory diseases in Magnitogorsk was 3 times the national average. The incidence of cancer was double. The plant had been built in the 1930s, during the first 5-year plan, and it had been built for speed, not for environmental protection. The pollution controls that were standard in Western steel plants by the 1970s, electrostatic precipitators, scrubbers, wastewater treatment, were never installed. The plan did not require them. The cost of installing them would have reduced output. The system chose output. The environmental damage was not limited to a few high-profile sites. It was systemic. The Soviet Union's rivers were used as industrial sewers. The Volga, the country's most important waterway, received untreated waste from hundreds of factories, chemical plants, and cities. By the 1980s, the Volga's water was so contaminated that it was unsafe for swimming, let alone for drinking. The Lake Baikal, the world's deepest and oldest lake containing 20% of the planet's unfrozen freshwater, was polluted by a pulp and paper mill built on its shore in 1966. The mill discharged dioxins and other toxic chemicals into the lake, threatening an ecosystem that had evolved in isolation for 25 million years. The decision to build a mill at Baikal had been controversial even within the Soviet scientific community. Biologists and limnologists had warned that the lake's unique ecosystem was fragile and that pollution would be irreversible. The planners overruled them. The mill was built. The plan called for cellulose. The cellulose was produced. The lake was a cost that did not appear in the ledger. The social costs of industrialization were equally high, and they followed the same logic. The forced urbanization of the 1930s, driven by the first 5-year plan, created a rootless proletariat. Millions of peasants were driven off the land by collectivization and into the cities, where they were housed in communal apartments, kommunalki. These were large, pre-revolutionary apartments, originally designed for single bourgeois families, that were subdivided into multiple rooms, each occupied by a different family. A typical kommunalka might house 5 or 6 families, sharing a single kitchen, a single bathroom, and a single toilet. Privacy was non-existent. The walls were thin, the corridors were dark and narrow. The apartments were infested with rats and cockroaches. The living conditions were a direct consequence of the system's priorities. The plan allocated resources to heavy industry, not to housing. The state built factories, not homes. The workers were expected to find shelter wherever they could. By the 1970s, more than 20 million Soviet citizens were still living in kommunalki. The official propaganda, which showed happy families in modern apartments, was a lie that everyone knew. The gap between the image and the reality fueled a deep cynicism. The system promised a new civilization. It delivered a rat-infested corridor. Alcoholism was a direct consequence of these conditions. The Soviet Union had one of the highest rates of alcohol consumption in the world. By the 1980s, the average Soviet adult consumed the equivalent of 14 liters of pure alcohol per year, more than double the World Health Organization's definition of hazardous drinking. The health consequences were devastating. Life expectancy for Soviet men actually declined between 1965 and 1985, from 66 to 63 years, a phenomenon unprecedented in a developed country during peacetime. The decline was driven by cardiovascular disease, accidents, and violence, all of which were linked to alcohol. The system responded not by addressing the underlying causes, the cramped housing, the meaningless work, the lack of consumer goods, but by attempting to control production. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev launched an anti-alcohol campaign, reducing production and raising prices. The campaign was a failure. It reduced official sales but drove drinkers to home-brewed spirits, which were often toxic. The death rate from alcohol poisoning rose. The system could not solve the problem because the problem was not a policy failure. It was a structural feature. The Soviet economy had created a workforce that was physically and psychologically degraded. The degradation was not a side effect, it was a necessary condition. A healthy, contented population would have demanded more than the system could provide. The social damage was compounded by the system's treatment of dissent. Anyone who pointed out the gap between propaganda and reality was a dissident. The state's response was repression. Psychiatrists were used to diagnose political dissent as mental illness. Dissidents were confined to psychiatric hospitals, where they were treated with drugs that induced psychosis. The system pathologized the awareness of its own failures. The result was a society in which the truth was dangerous. People learned to say one thing and think another. The doublethink that George Orwell had described in 1984 was not a literary invention, it was a survival strategy. The system demanded public conformity and punished private truth. The cost was a society that could not honestly assess its own condition. The planners did not know the real state of the economy because no one would tell them. The managers did not report the real costs of production because the system punished bad news. The people did not express their real grievances because the KGB was listening. The system was blind to its own destructiveness. The environmental and social damage was not a side effect. It was a direct consequence of the system's logic. The plan was the only reality. Human life was a resource to be consumed. The system measured success in tons of steel, barrels of oil, and kilowatt-hours of electricity. It measured nothing else. The cost of producing those goods, the destroyed rivers, the poisoned air, the shortened lives, the broken families, was not counted. It was not counted because it could not be counted. The central plan had no mechanism for incorporating externalities. There was no price for clean water, no price for breathable air, no price for a healthy life. The planners had no data on these things because the data did not exist. The system did not collect it. The system did not want it. The truth was a threat to the plan. The consequences of this blindness are still being measured. The Aral Sea will never recover. The best that can be hoped for is to stabilize what remains at a fraction of its original size. The Chernobyl exclusion zone will remain uninhabitable for centuries. The sarcophagus that was built to contain the reactor in 1986 is crumbling. A new containment structure, the new safe confinement, was completed in 2016 at a cost of 1.5 billion euros, but the problem of long-term waste storage remains unsolved. The soil in Norilsk is so contaminated that remediation may be impossible. The rivers of the former Soviet Union are still carrying the legacy of decades of industrial dumping. The health effects will be felt for generations. The social damage, the alcoholism, the cynicism, the distrust of institutions has persisted in the post-Soviet states. The psychological legacy of life under the plan is a deep skepticism of state authority and a preference for informal networks. The system created a population that had learned to survive by lying to the state and to itself. The question that this chapter set out to answer was whether the human cost of Soviet industrialization was uniquely severe. The evidence suggests that it was. The industrial revolutions of England, Germany, and the United States also exacted a terrible toll. The coal mines of 19th century England killed thousands of workers each year. The steel mills of Pittsburgh in the early 20th century produced air that was as toxic as the air in Magnitogorsk. The cotton plantations of the American South were built on the backs of enslaved people, but there was a crucial difference. In the capitalist economies, the cost was visible. It was debated. It was, eventually, addressed through regulation, labor organizing, and political reform. The Factory Acts of 19th century England limited child labor. The Clean Air Acts of the 20th century reduced industrial pollution. The labor movement won the right to organize and bargain collectively. The system had mechanisms for self-correction. The Soviet system did not. The plan was the only reality. The cost was not a variable. There was no mechanism for feedback. There was no constituency for reform. The system could not acknowledge its own failures because to do so would have been to acknowledge that the plan was flawed, and the plan was the foundation of the state's legitimacy. The result was that the damage was allowed to accumulate, unchecked, for decades. The Aral Sea was drained over a period of 30 years. The Chernobyl disaster was the culmination of a design flaw that had been known for 20 years. The pollution of Norilsk and Magnitogorsk was allowed to continue for half a century. The system did not stop because the system could not stop. The plan called for production, and production continued regardless of the cost. The human and environmental devastation was not a bug, it was a feature. It was the logical output of a system that had no mechanism for counting the cost of its own existence. The chapter's conclusion is not a moral judgment, it is an analytical one. The Soviet command economy was a machine for converting natural resources and human lives into industrial output. It was extraordinarily efficient at this conversion, in the narrow sense that it achieved its stated goals. The Soviet Union became the world's second largest industrial power. It built a nuclear arsenal that matched the United States. It put the first human into space, but the machine had no governor. It had no feedback loop. It had no mechanism for measuring the damage it was doing, and no mechanism for stopping. The damage was not a side effect. It was the product. The system consumed its own population and its own environment, and it did so without hesitation, without regret, and without the ability to change course. The legacy of that consumption is a landscape of ruins, a dead sea, a poisoned river, a radioactive zone, a city of shortened lives. The human cost of industrialization was not an accident, it was the plan. The central question of this chapter is not whether the Soviet command economy needed reform. By the mid-1960s, the answer to that was clear to everyone except the most dogmatic ideologues. The question is, why every attempt to fix the system, from the cautious market adjustments of 1965 to the sweeping radicalism of Perestroika, not only failed, but made the underlying disease worse. The answer lies in a fundamental incompatibility. The Soviet economy was not a flawed version of capitalism. It was a separate species of economic organization, one whose survival depended on the very features that reformers sought to eliminate. To tinker with it was to threaten its existence. And when reformers finally tried to change its core logic, the system did not transform. It shattered. The first serious attempt at systemic reform came in September 1965, when Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, with the backing of Party General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, announced a package of changes to the planning system. The Kosygin reforms were not a repudiation of central planning. They were an attempt to make it work better by introducing what economists call market socialism, a hybrid in which the state retained ownership of the means of production, but allowed enterprises some freedom to respond to market signals. Under the new rules, enterprises could retain a portion of their profits for investment and bonuses. Managers were given greater authority over hiring, wages, and product mix. The number of centrally mandated targets was reduced from dozens to just a handful: output volume, product mix, profitability, and a few others. For the first time since the end of the new economic policy in 1928, profit was officially recognized as a legitimate indicator of enterprise performance. The logic was sound. If managers had the freedom to decide what to produce and how to produce it, and if they could keep some of the profits from doing so efficiently, then the chronic shortages and quality problems of the command economy might be alleviated. The reforms drew on the work of Soviet economist Evsey Liberman, who had argued since the 1950s that the system's obsession with gross output, tons of steel, meters of cloth, ignored the real needs of consumers and downstream industries. Liberman's proposal was simple: let profit, not plan targets, guide enterprise behavior. Kosygin's reforms adopted this logic, but with a crucial caveat: the state would still set prices. It would still allocate most inputs, and the party would still appoint enterprise directors. That caveat proved fatal. The party bureaucracy, the Nomenklatura, had no interest in relinquishing control. For a regional party secretary, the ability to call a factory director and demand a shipment of bricks for a local construction project was not a bug in the system, it was the source of his power. The reforms threatened to make that power irrelevant. If enterprises responded to market signals rather than party commands, the entire apparatus of regional and sectoral control would lose its purpose. So the bureaucracy did what bureaucracies do: it slowed implementation, reinterpreted rules, and created exceptions. By 1968, the reforms had been effectively gutted. The number of centrally planned targets crept back up. Managers who had begun to experiment with market-oriented decisions found themselves criticized at party meetings. The profit retention mechanism was diluted by endless supplementary taxes and deductions. By the early 1970s, the Kosygin reforms were a dead letter, not because they were tried and failed, but because they were never truly allowed to work. The failure of the 1965 reforms set a pattern that would repeat itself for the next 2 decades. Every attempt to introduce market mechanisms was met with resistance from the very people who were supposed to implement them. The party elite understood, perhaps better than the reformers, that a market economy would dissolve their power. In a market, decisions are made by millions of dispersed actors responding to prices. In a command economy, decisions are made by a few thousand people in Moscow. The latter is a system of control. The former is a system of freedom. The Nomenklatura chose control. The Brezhnev era, which lasted from 1964 to 1982, is often described as a period of stagnation, zastoy in Russian. But stagnation is too passive a word. What occurred was an active process of ossification. The system did not merely drift, it was deliberately frozen in place. Brezhnev himself was not a reformer. He had risen through the party apparatus in the 1930s and 1940s, a time when the command economy was at its most brutal and most effective. His instinct was to preserve the system that had made him. Under his leadership, any proposal for significant economic change was met with a standard response. It would be studied by a commission, which would report to a committee, which would recommend further study. This was not incompetence. It was a deliberate strategy to delay reform until the reformers lost interest or were removed. The Brezhnev era also benefited from an extraordinary stroke of luck: the discovery of vast oil and gas fields in western Siberia. In 1964, the Soviet Union was a net oil importer. By 1980, it was the world's largest oil producer. The oil price shocks of 1973 and 1979, which devastated Western economies, were a windfall for the Soviet Union. Hard currency from oil exports allowed the regime to import grain to feed the population, Western technology to prop up failing industries, and consumer goods to buy off discontent. The oil revenues masked the underlying decay. Between 1970 and 1980, Soviet economic growth slowed from an already modest 5% per year to less than 2%. But because the oil money kept flowing, the regime never had to confront the structural crisis. It could afford to do nothing. The cost of doing nothing was deferred, not avoided. By the early 1980s, the Soviet economy was a machine running on borrowed time. The oil boom was ending. The technological gap with the West was widening. The population was growing restive. When Brezhnev died in 1982, followed by his two short-lived successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, the system was in a state of advanced decay. It fell to Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary in March 1985, to attempt what his predecessors had avoided, a fundamental restructuring of the Soviet economy. Gorbachev's program, known as Perestroika, or restructuring, was far more radical than anything Kosygin had proposed. Perestroika was not a set of incremental adjustments, it was an attempt to change the very logic of the system. The centerpiece was the Law on State Enterprise, enacted in 1987, which introduced the principle of self-financing. Enterprises were now supposed to cover their costs from their own revenues. They could set their own prices for some products. They could enter into contracts with other enterprises without approval from Moscow. They could even, in a stunning departure from Soviet orthodoxy, establish joint ventures with foreign firms. The goal was to transform the Soviet enterprise from a passive executor of state orders into an active participant in a market economy. At the same time, Gorbachev legalized private economic activity in the form of cooperatives. The 1988 law on cooperatives allowed individuals to form small businesses to provide services, restaurants, repair shops, taxi services that the state sector had never adequately supplied. For the first time since the 1920s, private enterprise was legal in the Soviet Union. The cooperatives were not a marginal phenomenon. By 1990, there were over 200,000 of them, employing nearly 5 million people. They produced goods and services that were often superior to those of state enterprises, and they did so at a profit. Perestroika also included a dramatic opening to the outside world. Gorbachev's foreign policy, which he called New Thinking, reduced Cold War tensions and allowed for increased trade and investment. The Soviet Union began to import Western management techniques, accounting standards, and even computer systems. The hope was that exposure to global markets would force Soviet enterprises to become competitive. The theory was coherent. The practice was catastrophic. Perestroika created what economists call a half-reform trap. State-owned enterprises were told to act like market firms, to respond to prices, to seek profits, to innovate, but they still faced soft budget constraints. A soft budget constraint means that an enterprise knows it will be bailed out if it fails. If a factory could not cover its costs, the state would provide subsidies, or the central bank would issue loans that would never be repaid. Under the old system, this did not matter much, because the state also set prices and output targets. Under Perestroika, enterprises were given freedom without responsibility. The result was predictable. Enterprises used their new pricing freedom to raise prices, not to improve quality. A factory that produced shoddy shoes simply charged more for them. A collective farm that could not meet its grain target sold its output on the black market at inflated prices. The cooperatives, which were supposed to be a dynamic new sector, were often run by former party officials who used their connections to obtain scarce inputs and then resold them at enormous markups. The cooperatives became a symbol of profiteering, not innovation. The half-reform trap had a second, more insidious effect. Because enterprises could now set prices but still face no real competition, they had no incentive to become efficient. The old system had at least imposed some discipline through the plan. If you did not meet your target, you faced consequences. Under Perestroika, the plan was weakened, but the market was not yet strong enough to replace it. Enterprises existed in a kind of limbo, neither planned nor competitive. They responded by doing what any organization in that situation would do. They extracted as much revenue as possible while providing as little value as possible. The macroeconomic consequences were devastating. With enterprises raising prices and the state printing money to cover its deficits, inflation soared. Official statistics underestimated the true rate, but by 1990, prices in the cooperative sector were rising at 20 to 30% per year. The state budget deficit, which had been manageable in the early 1980s, ballooned to 10% of GDP by 1989. The government tried to cover the deficit by borrowing from the central bank, which simply printed more money. The ruble, which had been artificially strong under the old system, began to lose value rapidly. The shortages that had always plagued the Soviet economy grew worse. By 1990, the shelves of state stores were emptier than they had been since the darkest days of World War II. In Moscow and Leningrad, people stood in line for hours to buy bread, sugar, and soap. The cooperatives, which could charge market prices, had goods, but ordinary citizens could not afford them. The black market flourished, but it was a black market of desperation, not of luxury. The system was not reforming. It was unraveling. Gorbachev found himself trapped between two irreconcilable forces. On one side were the conservatives, the party hardliners who had never wanted Perestroika in the first place. They saw the chaos and demanded a return to central planning. They argued that the reforms had gone too far, that the cooperatives were a form of capitalism, that the opening to the West was a betrayal of socialist principles. On the other side were the radicals, led by figures like Boris Yeltsin, who argued that Perestroika had not gone far enough. They demanded a complete transition to a market economy, including the abolition of state planning and the privatization of state enterprises. Gorbachev tried to steer a middle course. He could not. The conservative backlash came first. In 1990, the government of Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhkov attempted to reverse course. It reintroduced price controls on many goods and tried to crack down on the cooperatives. The result was a disaster. The price controls created even worse shortages, because producers had no incentive to sell at artificially low prices. The crackdown on cooperatives destroyed the only sector that was actually producing goods. The economy contracted by 3% in 1990 and by 5% in 1991. The radical challenge came from the Russian Republic, the largest and most powerful of the Soviet republics. In June 1990, the Russian parliament declared that its laws took precedence over Soviet laws. Yeltsin, who had been elected chairman of the Russian parliament, began to implement his own economic reforms. He proposed a plan known as the 500 Days program, which called for the rapid privatization of state enterprises, the liberalization of prices, and the introduction of a market economy within a year and a half. Gorbachev initially endorsed the plan, then backed away under pressure from conservatives. The 500 Days program was debated, modified, and ultimately abandoned. It was the last chance for a controlled transition to a market economy. After it failed, there was no alternative to collapse. The failure of Perestroika was not a failure of policy, it was a failure of structure. The Soviet command economy was not a system that could be reformed because its core logic was incompatible with market signals. A market economy works through prices, which convey information about scarcity and demand. A command economy works through commands, which convey information about political priorities. The two systems are not different versions of the same thing, they are opposites. Attempting to mix them creates a system that has the worst features of both: the inefficiency of planning without its discipline, the chaos of markets without their feedback. Consider the problem of prices. In a market economy, prices are determined by supply and demand. If a good is scarce, its price rises, which encourages producers to make more and consumers to use less. In a command economy, prices are set by the state, often at levels that have nothing to do with scarcity. Bread was priced so low in the Soviet Union that farmers fed it to their livestock because it was cheaper than grain. That was not a mistake. It was a consequence of a system in which prices were political, not economic. Perestroika tried to introduce market prices without allowing the market to determine them. The result was that prices rose but shortages persisted because the price increases did not reflect real scarcity. They reflected the power of enterprises to extract rents. The same problem applied to the question of ownership. In a market economy, private ownership gives owners an incentive to use resources efficiently. In a command economy, state ownership means that no one has a clear incentive to improve performance. Perestroika tried to introduce market incentives without changing ownership. Enterprises were told to maximize profits, but the profits belonged to the state. Managers had no real stake in the long-term success of their firms. They had every incentive to strip assets, to pay themselves bonuses, to do whatever would make them look good in the short term. The cooperatives, which were privately owned, performed better, but they were a small sector. The bulk of the economy remained in state hands, and it continued to decay. The half-reformed trap was not unique to the Soviet Union. It had been observed in other socialist economies, most notably in Hungary and Yugoslavia, where earlier attempts at market socialism had produced similar results. But the Soviet case was the most dramatic, because the scale was so large and the stakes so high. By 1991, the Soviet economy was in freefall. The budget deficit was out of control, the ruble was collapsing. The shortages were worse than at any time since the war. The population was angry and desperate. Gorbachev had lost control of both the conservatives and the radicals. The system was no longer capable of governing itself. The final blow came from an unexpected direction: the republics. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had been the first to declare economic sovereignty in 1989 and 1990. They began to create their own currencies, their own customs services, their own economic policies. The Russian Republic followed. By the summer of 1991, the Soviet economic space was fragmenting. Enterprises in one republic could not get paid by enterprises in another. The central planning system, which had depended on the unity of the entire territory, ceased to function. The attempted coup by hardliners in August 1991 was a desperate attempt to reverse this process. It failed, and with it, the Soviet Union itself. The lesson of the Kosygin reforms and Perestroika is not that the Soviet economy was poorly managed. It is that the Soviet economy was a system with a specific logic, and that logic could not be changed from within. The command economy worked, to the extent that it ever worked, because it suppressed the very forces that a market economy requires: decentralized decision-making, price signals, private ownership, competition. To introduce those forces was to destroy the system, and destroy it they did. The failure of reform was not a matter of bad policy choices, it was a structural inevitability. The Soviet system could not be reformed because its core logic, central allocation of resources by political command, was incompatible with the core logic of a market, decentralized allocation by price signals. Any attempt to mix them produced a hybrid that was worse than either pure form. The half-reform trap was not a trap that could be escaped by better design. It was a trap that could only be escaped by destroying the system entirely. This is the uncomfortable truth that both Western observers and Soviet reformers were slow to grasp. The conventional wisdom in the 1960s and 1970s was that the Soviet economy would gradually converge with Western capitalism. The theory of convergence held that all industrial economies, regardless of ideology, faced similar challenges and would adopt similar solutions. The Soviet Union would introduce market mechanisms, the West would introduce planning, and the two systems would meet in the middle. The Kosygin reforms were seen as evidence of this convergence. Perestroika was seen as its culmination. The convergence theory was wrong. The Soviet economy did not converge with capitalism, it collapsed. The reason is that the two systems were not different paths to the same destination. They were different destinations entirely. A command economy is not a less efficient version of a market economy. It is a different kind of system, with its own logic, its own incentives, its own pathologies. To introduce market elements into a command economy is not to improve it. It is to create contradictions that the system cannot resolve. The example of the nail factory, which appeared in an earlier chapter, illustrates the point. Under central planning, a nail factory could meet its target by producing one giant nail or millions of tiny nails, neither of which was useful. The Kosygin reforms tried to fix this by giving the manager more freedom and tying bonuses to profit. But if the state continued to set the price of nails, the manager would still have no real information about what customers wanted. The price of a nail under state control was not a market price, it was a political price. The manager could not respond to market signals because there were no market signals to respond to. Perestroika tried to solve this by allowing enterprises to set their own prices. But without competition, the nail factory simply raised its prices. It did not improve its product. It did not become more efficient. It just charged more for the same shoddy nails. The customers, construction firms, manufacturers, individual consumers had no alternative. They paid the higher prices, and the nail factory continued to produce useless nails. The only difference was that now the nails were more expensive. The half-reform trap had a final, devastating consequence. It destroyed the legitimacy of the system itself. Under the old command economy, people accepted the shortages and the poor quality because they believed that the system was at least fair. Everyone was in the same boat. The party elite had its privileges, but they were hidden. Under Perestroika, the privileges became visible. The cooperatives, which were often run by party officials, made enormous profits while ordinary people stood in line for bread. The black market, which had always existed, became the only way to get anything of value. The result was a profound loss of faith. The population no longer believed that the system could deliver a better life. They no longer believed that the system was legitimate. They no longer believed that the system would survive. By 1991, the Soviet economy was not just failing, it was dying. The reforms had not saved it, they had accelerated its end. The lesson is stark and unavoidable. A planned economy can only be reformed by destroying it. The attempt to introduce market mechanisms without dismantling the structure of central control creates a system that is neither planned nor market. It is a system of chaos, in which the worst elements of both systems combine to produce something worse than either. The Soviet Union did not collapse because its reforms were too radical or too timid. It collapsed because its reforms revealed the fundamental incompatibility between its structure and any alternative. The system could not be fixed, it could only be replaced. The failure of the Kosygin reforms and Perestroika is not a story of missed opportunities or incompetent leadership. It is a story of structural impossibility. The Soviet command economy was a machine designed for one purpose, the mobilization of resources for state-determined ends. It was not designed to respond to consumer demand, to innovate, to allocate capital efficiently, or to provide a decent standard of living. It was designed to build steel mills and tanks. When the state decided that it wanted the machine to do something else, to produce quality goods, to compete in global markets, to satisfy consumers, the machine could not adapt. The attempt to force it to adapt broke it. The final irony is that the reformers understood this, at least in part. Kosygin knew that his reforms were limited. Gorbachev knew that Perestroika was a gamble. But they were trapped by the system they were trying to change. They could not abandon central planning entirely, because that would have meant abandoning the party's control over the economy. They could not maintain central planning as it was, because that would have meant accepting economic decline. They tried to find a middle path. There was none. The Soviet Union's experience with reform offers a cautionary lesson for any system that attempts to combine incompatible logics. A system built on command cannot be made to respond to markets without destroying itself. The attempt to do so is not reform. It is demolition by slow motion. And when the demolition is complete, what remains is not a reformed system, but a wreckage from which something new must be built. That is what happened in 1991. The Soviet Union did not reform itself into a market economy, it collapsed into one. The difference is not semantic. It is the difference between a controlled transition and a catastrophic implosion. The Kosygin reforms, the Brezhnev stagnation, and Gorbachev's perestroika are not three separate episodes. They are three acts of the same tragedy. In the first act, the reformers tried to introduce market mechanisms and were blocked by the bureaucracy. In the second act, the system drifted on a cushion of oil revenues, avoiding the need for change. In the third act, the reformers tried to change the system from within, and discovered that the system could not be changed. It could only be destroyed. The tragedy is that the destruction was not the result of the reforms. It was the result of the system's inability to accommodate them. The Soviet economy was not killed by its enemies. It was killed by its own internal contradictions, which the reforms exposed but could not resolve. The question that remains is whether there was any alternative. Could the Soviet Union have transitioned to a market economy without the chaos and collapse of 1991? The evidence from other post-communist transitions suggests that the answer is yes, but only under specific conditions. Poland, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states managed to transition relatively smoothly because they moved quickly and decisively. They did not try to introduce market mechanisms while maintaining state ownership and central control. They privatized, liberalized prices, and opened their economies to competition. The result was painful but temporary. The Soviet Union tried a different path. It tried to reform without destroying. That path led to destruction anyway. The lesson is not that reform is impossible. It is that reform of a command economy requires a complete break with the past. Half measures do not work. They create a system that is worse than either pure command or pure market. The Soviet Union's tragedy is that its leaders could not bring themselves to make that break until it was too late. By the time they were willing to contemplate radical change, the system was already in its death throes. The reforms did not cause the death. They merely revealed that the patient had been dying for decades. In the end, the Soviet command economy was not reformed, it was replaced. The replacement was not the work of reformers. It was the work of history. The system had exhausted its possibilities. It had no more room for adaptation. It had reached the limits of tinkering, and when it reached those limits, it collapsed. The reformers did not fail. They succeeded in demonstrating that the system could not be saved. That is a kind of success, but it is not the kind they intended. The Soviet Union did not die because of the reforms. It died because it could not live with them. The central question of this chapter is not whether the Soviet planned economy failed, that is well established, but how ordinary people managed to live within a system that was, by any measure, fundamentally broken. The official economy, with its chronic shortages, absurd production targets, and indifferent bureaucracy, could not provide the basic necessities of life. Yet people did not starve in the streets. They did not freeze in unheated apartments. They found ways to obtain food, clothing, medical care, and even luxuries. The answer lies in a vast, parallel universe of economic activity that existed alongside the official plan, the shadow economy. This was not a marginal phenomenon. By the 1980s, estimates from Soviet economists and Western analysts converged on a startling figure. Between 20 and 30% of all economic activity in the Soviet Union was unofficial. It was not a crime in the conventional sense, nor was it a form of resistance. It was a survival mechanism, a necessary adaptation to a system that could not fulfill its own promises. The shadow economy was not a single, coherent entity. It was a spectrum of activities, ranging from the entirely legal to the flagrantly illegal, with a vast grey zone in between. At one end stood the private plots of collective farmers. These tiny patches of land, typically less than half a hectare, were officially permitted as a concession to peasant tradition. But their significance far exceeded their size. In the 1970s, these private plots, which accounted for only 3% of all agricultural land in the Soviet Union, produced approximately 30% of the nation's food supply. They yielded meat, milk, eggs, vegetables, and fruit that the state-run collective farms could not or would not produce efficiently. A collective farmer might spend his official working hours on the kolkhoz, the collective farm, fulfilling quotas for grain or cotton. But his real labor and his family's real sustenance came from the private plot. The vegetables grown there were not just for personal consumption. Surplus produce was sold at the collective farm markets, the kolkhozные rynki, which existed in every city. These markets were legal, but they operated outside the state distribution system. Prices were determined by supply and demand, not by Gosplan. A city dweller could buy fresh tomatoes in August, but at a price far higher than the official state price for canned tomatoes in a state store. The private plot economy was a constant, visible reminder that the official system could not feed its own people. At the other end of the spectrum lay the black market, the Cherny Rynok. This was the realm of Western goods, jeans, records, electronics, cosmetics, and cigarettes. These items were not just desirable, they were symbols of a world beyond the Soviet border, a world of choice and abundance that the official system could neither provide nor acknowledge. A pair of Levi's jeans, which might cost $15 in New York, could fetch 200 rubles on the black market in Moscow in the 1970s, roughly a month's salary for an average worker. A Beatles record, pressed on cheap Soviet vinyl, was a prized possession. A Japanese cassette player was a mark of status. The black market was not a fringe operation run by petty criminals. It was a sophisticated network that reached into the highest levels of the party and state. The most sought-after goods were often funneled through the very system that was supposed to suppress them. Intourist, the state travel agency, had access to foreign currency and could import Western goods for foreign tourists. Some of those goods inevitably leaked into the black market. The diplomatic corps, with their access to hard currency shops, were another source. And party officials themselves, the Nomenklatura, were often the most active participants. A factory director who had access to imported machinery might divert a spare part or a piece of equipment to a black market contact. A regional party secretary who controlled access to scarce building materials could trade them for a Western car. The black market was not a rebellion against the system, it was a parasite that lived off the system's own inefficiencies and privileges. Between the legal private plots and the illegal black market lay the vast domain of Blat. Blat is a Russian word that defies precise translation. It is often described as the use of personal connections to obtain goods and services, but that definition is too narrow. Blat was a social system, a way of life. It was the recognition that the official economy was unreliable and that the only reliable currency was personal trust. A person needed to know a doctor to get good medical treatment. He needed to know a store clerk to get meat. He needed to know a mechanic to fix his car. He needed to know a teacher to get his child into a good university. Blat was not bribery in the conventional sense. It did not usually involve money changing hands. It was a system of reciprocal favors, a web of obligations that could be called upon when needed. If you could get your neighbor's son a job at the factory where you worked, your neighbor might be able to get you a ticket to a sold-out concert. If you could help a friend's sister get an apartment, that friend might be able to get your daughter a pair of shoes from the store where she worked. Blat was a form of social capital, and it was essential for survival. The mechanics of Blat were intricate and deeply embedded in daily life. The most common form was the pull, the znakomstvo, the personal connection. A person would say, "I have a pull at the meat store," meaning he knew someone who worked there, who could set aside a good cut of meat before it disappeared from the shelves. The pull was activated through a series of social rituals: a phone call, a visit, a bottle of vodka, a box of chocolates. The request was never made directly. It was always framed as a favor, a small kindness. "Could you help me with something?" The answer was almost always yes, because the person being asked knew that he might need a favor in return someday. The system was self-reinforcing. The more people you knew, the more favors you could call in, the more goods and services you could access. The fewer people you knew, the more you were at the mercy of the official system, which meant long lines, empty shelves, and indifferent clerks. Blat was not democratic. It favored the well-connected, the extroverted, the resourceful. But it was also a great equalizer in one sense. Everyone, from the factory worker to the party secretary, participated in it. The difference was one of scale. A party secretary had access to a wider network of favors, but he was still dependent on that network. No one in the Soviet Union could live entirely outside the shadow economy. The state's attitude toward the shadow economy was one of studied ambiguity. Officially, it was illegal. The Soviet Criminal Code prohibited private entrepreneurial activity, speculation, and the use of state property for personal gain. The penalties could be severe: imprisonment, exile, even execution in the Stalin era. But in practice, the state tolerated the shadow economy because it was necessary. The official system could not provide for basic needs. If the state had strictly enforced its own laws, the economy would have collapsed. The private plots produced the food that the collective farms could not. The black market provided the consumer goods that the state stores could not stock. Blat oiled the wheels of a creaking bureaucracy. The state looked the other way, but it did so with a knowing wink. There were periodic crackdowns, usually for political reasons. A factory director who had fallen out of favour might be prosecuted for economic crimes. A black marketeer who had grown too visible might be arrested. But the system as a whole was allowed to function. It was a tacit bargain. The state would not enforce its own rules, and the people would not openly challenge the state's authority. This tolerance had a corrosive effect on the system's legitimacy. If everyone was breaking the rules, then the rules were meaningless. The state's moral authority evaporated. The official ideology, with its promises of equality, justice and abundance, became a hollow joke. People learned to live a double life. In public, they recited the slogans. In private, they mocked them. They knew that the party officials who lectured them about socialist morality were the same people who used Blat to get their children into the best universities and their wives the best Western clothes. The gap between the official rhetoric and the daily reality was not just wide, it was unbridgeable. The shadow economy was not a challenge to the system, it was a symptom of the system's failure. It revealed that the system could not deliver what it promised, and that the people had no faith in it. The culture of Blat created a society where trust was personal, not institutional. In a functioning market economy, trust is embedded in institutions. You trust that the bank will honor your deposit. You trust that the store will sell you a product of a certain quality. You trust that the doctor has the necessary qualifications. You trust that the law will protect you if you are cheated. In the Soviet Union, none of these institutional trusts existed. The bank might not have the cash. The store might have rotten meat. The doctor might be incompetent. The law might be arbitrary. The only trust that mattered was personal trust, the trust between two people who knew each other and who had a history of exchanging favors. This personal trust was intense and reliable, but it was also extremely narrow. It did not extend to strangers. It did not extend to the state. It did not extend to the future. It was a trust based on immediate, reciprocal obligation, not on abstract principles or long-term planning. This had profound consequences for the social fabric. On the one hand, Blat created strong, resilient networks of mutual support. People looked after each other. They shared information, resources, and opportunities. The family, the circle of friends, the network of colleagues, these were the real safety nets. In a crisis, a person could rely on his Blat network in a way he could never rely on the state. On the other hand, Blat created a society of suspicion and cynicism. Everyone assumed that everyone else was cheating the system. Everyone assumed that the only way to get ahead was through connections, not merit. The official world was a world of lies. The private world was a world of truth, but that truth was limited to a small circle. Beyond that circle, there was only distrust. The Soviet Union was a society of atomized individuals, each clinging to his own small network, each suspicious of everyone else. The shadow economy was not a phenomenon that emerged suddenly in the 1970s. It had roots that went back to the very beginning of the Soviet system. In the 1920s, during the new economic policy, private trade was legal and widespread. The NEP was a period of relative prosperity and cultural ferment, but it was also a period of inequality and social tension. Stalin's Great Turn of 1928 was a violent reaction against the NEP. The first 5-year plan aimed to eliminate private trade and replace it with state planning. But the plan could not eliminate human ingenuity. The moment the state created shortages, the black market appeared. The moment the state created queues, Blat appeared. The moment the state created collective farms, the private plots appeared. The shadow economy was not a deviation from the Soviet system, it was an integral part of it. It was the system's shadow, its dark twin, the thing it could not acknowledge but could not live without. The scale of the shadow economy grew over time. In the Stalin era, it was dangerous to participate. The penalties were draconian. But as the terror receded and the system stabilized, the risks diminished. By the Brezhnev era, the shadow economy was an open secret. Everyone knew about it. Everyone participated in it. The state's tolerance became institutionalized. There were even official mechanisms for channeling shadow activity. The second economy, as it was sometimes called, was studied by Soviet sociologists and economists, though their findings were rarely published. They knew that the official statistics were meaningless. They knew that the real economy was far larger than the official one. But they could not say so publicly. The most visible form of the shadow economy was the black market in consumer goods. But the shadow economy also penetrated the industrial sector. Factory managers routinely lied about their production figures. They hoarded raw materials and spare parts. They used state equipment and labor to produce goods for the black market. They paid workers off the books. They engaged in barter with other factories, swapping surplus goods for needed inputs. This was not petty theft. It was a systematic response to the irrationalities of central planning. A factory manager who followed the rules would fail. A factory manager who bent the rules would succeed. The system rewarded rule breaking, even as it punished it. The shadow economy also had a significant impact on the distribution of income. The official system was supposed to be egalitarian. In practice, it was deeply unequal. The Nomenklatura had access to special stores and services, but the shadow economy created its own inequalities. A skilled black marketeer could earn far more than a factory director. A doctor who used Blat to get his patients better treatment could build a network of grateful clients who would provide him with goods and services. A mechanic who could fix cars could command favors that money could not buy. The shadow economy created a parallel class structure, one based not on party loyalty, but on resourcefulness and connections. The culture of Blat was not unique to the Soviet Union. It existed in other socialist countries, and it exists in many societies with weak institutions. But in the Soviet context, it took on a particular intensity. The Soviet Union was a society of extreme scarcity and extreme bureaucracy. The combination was explosive. People learned to navigate the system by mastering its informal rules. They learned that the official rules were a guide, not a constraint. They learned that the only way to get things done was to bypass the system, to use personal connections, to trade favors. This was not a matter of choice. It was a matter of survival. The legacy of the shadow economy and the culture of Blat did not disappear with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It persisted, and it continues to shape the societies of Russia and Eastern Europe today. The post-Soviet economies inherited a population that was deeply skeptical of institutions, deeply reliant on personal networks, and deeply accustomed to operating outside the law. The transition to a market economy was not a clean break. It was a messy, often corrupt process in which the skills of the shadow economy, the ability to bend rules, to make deals, to operate in grey areas, became valuable assets. The Blat networks of the Soviet era became the business networks of the post-Soviet era. The black marketeers became the oligarchs. The shadow economy did not vanish, it simply changed form. The central question of this chapter, how did ordinary people survive, has a complex answer. They survived by creating a parallel economy that was more flexible, more responsive, and more human than the official one. They survived by relying on each other, by building networks of trust and reciprocity, by bending and breaking the rules. They survived by living a double life, one public and one private. They survived by becoming experts in the art of the possible. But this survival came at a cost. The shadow economy undermined the legitimacy of the state. It eroded public trust in institutions. It created a society of cynics and opportunists. It left a legacy of corruption and informality that would outlast the system that produced it. The shadow economy was not a solution, it was a symptom, and the symptom outlived the disease. To understand the shadow economy, one must understand the psychology of scarcity. The Soviet system was not just a system of production, it was a system of distribution, and that system was fundamentally broken. The state controlled the allocation of almost everything: food, housing, clothing, medical care, education, transportation. The state decided who got what, when, and where. But the state could not make these decisions rationally. It did not know what people wanted. It did not know how much they needed. It did not know how to get goods from the factory to the consumer efficiently. The result was a constant state of shortage. There was never enough of anything. The queues were long, the shelves were empty, the quality was poor. The choice was non-existent. In this world of scarcity, the shadow economy was a lifeline. The most vivid example of the shadow economy in action was the queue itself. The queue was not just a place to wait. It was a social institution. People in queues shared information. They knew which stores had which goods. They knew when shipments were expected. They knew which clerks could be bribed. They knew which products were worth waiting for. The queue was a market in miniature. It was a place where goods were allocated not by price, but by time and patience. But the queue was also a place where Blat operated. A person who knew someone in the store could skip the queue. A person who could offer a favor to the store manager could get access to goods before they were put on the shelves. The queue was a visible symbol of the system's failure, but it was also a visible symbol of the people's resourcefulness. The shadow economy was not limited to consumer goods. It extended into the service sector. In the Soviet system, many services were provided by the state, but they were often of poor quality or unavailable. A person who needed a plumber would not call the state housing office. He would ask his neighbors if they knew someone who could fix a pipe. That someone was likely a plumber who worked for the state during the day and moonlighted for cash or favors at night. The same was true for electricians, carpenters, tailors, and mechanics. The private sector of the Soviet economy was not a sector at all. It was a vast, informal network of people who used their state jobs as a base for private work. The state paid them a low salary. The shadow economy paid them a living wage. The shadow economy also played a crucial role in the distribution of housing. The state allocated apartments, but the waiting lists were years long. A young couple might wait a decade for a one-room apartment. The only way to speed up the process was through Blat. A person who knew a housing official could get his name moved up the list. A person who could offer a bribe could get a better apartment. The housing market was a shadow market. Apartments were swapped, sold, and rented through informal networks. The state pretended not to notice. The people pretended that the rules were being followed. Everyone knew the truth. The shadow economy was a world of paradoxes. It was illegal, but it was tolerated. It was corrupt, but it was necessary. It was a sign of the system's failure, but it was also a sign of the people's resilience. It was a source of inequality, but it was also a source of opportunity. It was a threat to the state's authority, but it was also a safety valve that prevented the system from collapsing entirely. The shadow economy was not a choice, it was a condition of existence. The culture of Blat had a profound impact on the way people thought about the state. The state was not a provider. It was an obstacle. The state was not a source of justice, it was a source of arbitrary power. The state was not a protector. It was a predator. This attitude was not a product of ideology, it was a product of experience. People learned from an early age that the state could not be trusted. They learned that the only reliable source of help was family, friends, and acquaintances. They learned that the only way to get ahead was to work the system, not to work within it. This attitude did not disappear when the Soviet Union collapsed. It became the default mode of social interaction in the post-Soviet world. The shadow economy also had a significant impact on the economy as a whole. It distorted official statistics. It made it impossible for planners to know what was really happening. It created a parallel system of prices, wages, and profits that bore no relation to the official ones. It drained resources from the official economy. It encouraged corruption and inefficiency. But it also provided a degree of flexibility that the official economy lacked. It allowed people to respond to changing conditions. It allowed resources to flow to where they were most needed. It allowed innovation, albeit on a small scale. The shadow economy was a double-edged sword. It undermined the system, but it also sustained it. The most sophisticated analysis of the shadow economy came from Soviet economists themselves, though they could not publish their findings openly. One of the most important was Gregory Grossman, a Western scholar who studied the Soviet second economy in the 1970s. Grossman estimated that the shadow economy accounted for between 10 and 20% of the Soviet GNP. Other scholars put the figure higher. The Soviet sociologist Tatyana Zaslavskaya conducted surveys that revealed the extent of Blat in everyday life. She found that nearly all Soviet citizens had used personal connections to obtain goods or services at some point. The shadow economy was not a niche, it was the norm. The black market in Western goods was the most glamorous aspect of the shadow economy, but it was not the most important. The most important aspect was the private plot. The private plot was the foundation of the shadow economy. It was legal, but it operated outside the state system. It was small, but it was productive. It was a reminder that the Soviet system could not feed itself. The private plot was a constant, visible challenge to the claims of the official ideology. It was a demonstration that the market worked better than the plan. It was a seed of doubt that grew into a forest of cynicism. The shadow economy was not a static phenomenon. It evolved over time. In the 1960s, it was relatively small and localized. By the 1980s, it was a vast, interconnected network that spanned the entire country. The growth of the shadow economy was a direct result of the stagnation of the official economy. As the official economy slowed down, the shadow economy accelerated. As the state's ability to provide declined, the people's reliance on informal networks increased. The shadow economy was not a cause of the system's collapse, it was a symptom, but it was a symptom that accelerated the disease. The final years of the Soviet Union saw an explosion of the shadow economy. Perestroika, Gorbachev's reform program, legalized some forms of private enterprise. Cooperatives were allowed to operate. But the legalization did not eliminate the shadow economy. It simply moved some of it into the open. The line between the legal and the illegal became even more blurred. The shadow economy did not disappear. It became the foundation of the new market economy. The legacy of the shadow economy is still visible today. In Russia, the informal economy accounts for a significant share of economic activity. The culture of Blat persists. People still rely on personal connections to get things done. Trust in institutions remains low. Corruption is endemic. The shadow economy of the Soviet era did not die. It was reborn in a new form. The question that this chapter has explored, how did ordinary people survive, is not a historical question. It is a question that continues to be asked and answered in the post-Soviet world. The answer is the same. They survived by relying on each other. They survived by working the system. They survived by living in the shadows. By 1989, the Soviet economy was not merely in crisis, it was in a death spiral. The numbers tell a story of systemic failure that no amount of ideological rhetoric could mask. The state budget deficit had ballooned to 10% of gross domestic product, a figure that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Inflation, long suppressed by price controls, had broken through the dam. Official statistics showed prices rising at modest rates, but the reality on the ground was far worse. In the black markets that now operated with near impunity, the ruble had lost most of its purchasing power. A pair of Western jeans that cost 100 rubles in 1985 now cost 500 or more. A kilogram of beef, if it could be found at all, sold for 3 times the official price. The state's own stores were empty, their shelves lined with nothing but vinegar, salt, and the occasional jar of pickled vegetables. The people who had been promised a bright communist future were now standing in lines that stretched for hours, hoping for bread. The collapse of oil prices in 1986 had been the trigger, but the disease was far deeper. The Soviet Union had become a petrostate, dependent on hard currency from oil and gas exports to pay for imported grain, machinery, and consumer goods. When the price of a barrel of crude fell from 30 to 10, the country lost roughly 20 billion per year in export revenues. That was money the system could not replace. The agricultural sector, despite decades of investment, could not feed the population. The industrial sector could not produce goods that anyone wanted to buy. The military-industrial complex, which consumed an estimated 25% of GDP, produced weapons that were increasingly obsolete. The Soviet Union had become a rentier economy without a rentier's cushion. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of sand. The central question of this chapter is not why the Soviet Union collapsed. That question has been answered many times, but how a system that had survived war, famine, and political terror could disintegrate so quickly once the economic foundations gave way. The answer lies in the final 3 years, From 1989 to 1991, when every lever of control slipped from the hands of a leadership that could no longer pretend to manage the unmanageable. The first sign of unraveling was the budget deficit. For decades, the Soviet state had balanced its books through a combination of price controls, wage controls, and the suppression of consumer demand. The state set prices for everything: bread, housing, energy, transport, and kept them artificially low. The difference between the cost of production and the price to consumers was absorbed by the state budget. This worked as long as the economy grew, but by the late 1980s, growth had stopped. The economy was stagnant, and the state's revenues were falling. The deficit had to be financed, and the only way to do it was to print money. The printing presses ran day and night. The money supply grew by 15% in 1988, 20% in 1989, and 30% in 1990. Inflation, which had been officially zero for decades, became a fact of life. The second sign was the collapse of the consumer goods sector. Soviet factories had always been oriented toward heavy industry and military production. Consumer goods were an afterthought, produced in leftover capacity with leftover materials. The result was a chronic shortage of everything from shoes to soap to furniture. But by 1989, the shortage had become acute. The state's distribution system, which had never been efficient, began to break down entirely. Goods that were produced in one republic were not shipped to another because the transport system was overwhelmed. Trucks sat idle for lack of fuel. Railways were clogged with military equipment. The result was a paradox. Factories were still producing, but the goods never reached the stores. In Moscow and Leningrad, the capital cities, the shelves were bare. In the provinces, they had been bare for years. The third sign was the rise of the black market as the primary mechanism of distribution. By 1989, the shadow economy accounted for an estimated 30% of all economic activity. This was not a marginal phenomenon. It was the economy. Ordinary people could not survive without it. They bought meat from butchers who sold it under the counter. They paid bribes to get their cars repaired. They traded favors for access to scarce goods. The state had lost control of the economy, and it knew it. The black market was no longer a criminal enterprise. It was the only way to get anything done. The leadership in Moscow understood that something had to be done. In 1990, a group of reform economists, led by Grigory Yavlinsky and Stanislav Shatalin, proposed a radical plan, the 500 Days Program. The name was literal. The plan called for a rapid transition to a market economy over the course of 500 days. It included the privatization of state enterprises, the liberalization of prices, the introduction of a convertible currency, and the creation of a social safety net. It was, in essence, a shock therapy plan, similar to what Poland would implement in 1990 and what Russia would attempt after the collapse. But the 500 Days plan was never implemented. Gorbachev wavered. He was caught between the reformers, who wanted to dismantle the old system, and the hardliners, who wanted to preserve it. He could not choose, and so he chose neither. The failure of the 500 Days plan was a pivotal moment. It demonstrated that the Soviet leadership was incapable of decisive action. The system was dying, but no one could agree on how to save it. The reformers argued for a rapid break with the past. The hardliners argued for a return to central planning. Gorbachev, caught in the middle, tried to compromise. He proposed a watered-down version of the plan that preserved state control over key sectors. The reformers rejected it. The hardliners rejected it. The plan died. And with it died the last chance for a controlled transition. The Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been watching these developments with growing alarm. They had been forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, and they had never accepted the legitimacy of Soviet rule. By 1990, they saw their chance. In March 1990, Lithuania declared independence. Estonia and Latvia followed in 1991. But the declarations of political independence were preceded by a more fundamental step: economic sovereignty. The Baltic republics began to assert control over their own economies. They refused to send tax revenues to Moscow. They established their own customs posts. They began to trade directly with Western countries. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a practical act of secession. The Baltic republics were the most industrialized and prosperous parts of the Soviet Union. Their departure meant that the central planning system lost its most productive components. The economic sovereignty of the Baltic republics had a cascading effect. Other republics began to follow suit. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, declared its economic sovereignty in July 1990. Russia, the largest republic, followed in October. The Russian declaration was particularly significant because Russia contained the bulk of the Soviet Union's natural resources: oil, gas, coal, timber. If Russia stopped sending revenues to Moscow, the central government would have no money at all. And that is exactly what happened. By the end of 1990, the Soviet budget was a fiction. The republics were keeping their revenues, and the central government was left with nothing but the printing press. In 1991, the Soviet economy experienced something it had never experienced before: a recorded economic contraction. Official statistics showed that gross domestic product fell by 5%, but the real figure was probably much higher. Industrial output fell by 8%. Agricultural output fell by 7%. Investment fell by 20%. The state's ability to distribute goods collapsed entirely. In the first half of 1991, the volume of goods shipped by rail fell by 15%. The number of trucks on the roads fell by 25%. The result was a catastrophic shortage of everything. In the winter of 1990-1991, the city of Moscow experienced rolling blackouts. In the summer of 1991, there were bread lines that stretched for blocks. The people who had been promised a communist utopia were now living in a world of scarcity. The collapse of the distribution system was the final blow. The Soviet economy had always been a shortage economy, but it had never been a famine economy. People had always been able to get enough to eat, even if the choices were limited, but in 1991 that changed. The grain harvest was poor, and the state could not afford to import grain from abroad. The result was a bread shortage that affected the entire country. In Moscow, the city government imposed rationing. Each person was allowed one loaf of bread per day. In Leningrad, the situation was even worse. The city's bakeries were running out of flour. The city government appealed to the central government for help. The central government had no flour to send. The economic crisis was compounded by a political crisis. In August 1991, a group of hardliners, the so-called State Committee on the State of Emergency, attempted to seize power. They arrested Gorbachev at his dacha in Crimea and announced that they were taking control of the country. Their goal was to preserve the Soviet Union and the communist system, but their coup failed. It failed because the economy was already beyond repair. The hardliners had no plan to fix the economy. They had no plan to feed the people. They had no plan to restore the distribution system. They had nothing but tanks and speeches, and the people were not willing to listen. The coup attempt was a last-ditch effort to preserve the system, but it was doomed from the start. The hardliners represented the old guard, the party apparatchiks, the military commanders, the KGB chiefs. They believed that the system could be saved by force. They were wrong. The system could not be saved because it had already collapsed. The economy was in ruins. The republics were seceding. The people were no longer afraid. When the tanks rolled into Moscow, they were met not by fear, but by defiance. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, climbed onto one of the tanks and called for resistance. The people came out into the streets. They built barricades. They faced down the soldiers. The coup collapsed in 3 days. The failure of the August coup was the end of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his authority was gone. The real power now lay with Yeltsin and the leaders of the republics. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus met in a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest and signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union. The Union of 15 republics, which had been created in 1922, was no more. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The experiment was over. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not a revolution from below. It was not a popular uprising that overthrew the regime. It was a death from 1,000 cuts. The system had lost all credibility. The people no longer believed in it. The elites no longer believed in it. Even the hardliners, when they attempted their coup, could not muster the will to defend it. The soldiers who were sent to occupy Moscow were met by their own countrymen. They did not fire. They did not need to. The system was already dead. The final irony is that the Soviet Union collapsed not because it was overthrown, but because it could no longer deliver the basic promise of the Five-Year Plan, a better life. The Five-Year Plan had been a promise of abundance. It had promised that the sacrifices of the present would be rewarded in the future. It had promised that the Soviet people would one day live in a world of plenty, but that promise had been broken. The future had arrived, and it was a future of empty shelves, long lines, and broken dreams. The system had failed on its own terms. It had not been defeated by capitalism. It had not been defeated by the West. It had been defeated by its own inability to deliver what it had promised. The collapse was not sudden, but it was swift. In 1988, the Soviet Union was still a superpower. It had a nuclear arsenal, a standing army, and a seat on the United Nations Security Council. By 1991, it was a failed state. The transformation was breathtaking, but it was not inexplicable. The seeds of collapse had been sown decades earlier. The system was built on a foundation of lies. The lies could be maintained as long as the economy grew. But when growth stopped, the lies became unsustainable. The people realized that the promises were empty. The elites realized that the system was broken, and so they let it go. The economic collapse of 1989-1991 was the final act of a tragedy that had been unfolding for decades. The budget deficit, the inflation, the oil price collapse, the empty stores, the black markets, the secession of the republics, the failed coup, these were not separate events. They were symptoms of a single disease, the inability of the command economy to adapt. The system had been designed for a different era. It had been designed for a world of scarcity, a world of war, a world of total mobilization. That world no longer existed. The Soviet Union had outlived its own economic model, and when the model failed, the state failed with it. The lesson is not that central planning is impossible. The lesson is that central planning, as it was practiced in the Soviet Union, was a system of control, not a system of production. It was designed to allocate resources according to political priorities, not economic efficiency. It was designed to reward loyalty, not competence. It was designed to suppress dissent, not to encourage innovation. And when the resources ran out, when the loyalty wavered, when the dissent could no longer be suppressed, the system collapsed. The collapse of the Soviet economy was not a mystery. It was the logical conclusion of a system that had been failing for decades. The failure was not the result of a single mistake, a single leader, or a single event. It was the result of a structure that was fundamentally unsound. The Five-Year Plan had created a new civilization, but it was a civilization built on sand. And when the tide came in, it washed away. The final years of the Soviet Union were a period of extraordinary drama. The world watched as a superpower disintegrated. The images are unforgettable. The empty shelves, the long lines, the tanks in the streets, the flag coming down. But the drama should not obscure the underlying reality. The collapse was not a surprise. It was not an accident. It was the end of a long process of decay. The system had been dying for years. The death was simply the final act. The question that remains is whether the collapse could have been prevented. Could the Soviet Union have reformed itself? Could it have transitioned to a market economy without disintegrating? The answer is probably no. The system was too rigid, too centralized, too dependent on control. The reforms that were attempted, the Kosygin reforms, Perestroika, were too little, too late. The system could not be reformed because the system was the problem. The only way to save the Soviet Union would have been to abandon the command economy entirely. And that was something the leadership could not do. They were prisoners of their own ideology. They could not imagine a world without central planning, and so they presided over the end. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a watershed moment in world history. It marked the end of the Cold War, the end of the bipolar world, the end of the communist experiment. But it was also a human tragedy. Millions of people lost their savings, their jobs, their security. The social safety net that had been provided by the state disappeared overnight. The result was a decade of chaos, poverty, and suffering. The transition to capitalism was brutal. The people who had been promised a better life found themselves living in a world of uncertainty. The final irony is that the Soviet Union collapsed not because it was too socialist, but because it was not socialist enough. The system had been corrupted by bureaucracy, by privilege, by the Nomenklatura. The promise of equality had been betrayed by the reality of inequality. The people who had been promised a classless society found themselves living in a society where the party elite had access to everything and everyone else had access to nothing. The system had created a new class, and that class had destroyed the system from within. The collapse of the Soviet economy is a story of hubris and failure. It is a story of a system that promised everything and delivered nothing. It is a story of a leadership that could not adapt, a population that could not endure, and a structure that could not survive. The 5-year plan had been a grand experiment. It had created a new civilization, but it was a civilization that could not sustain itself. And when the experiment ended, the civilization collapsed. The legacy of the collapse is still with us. The post-Soviet states are still struggling to build functioning economies. The environmental damage is still being cleaned up. The psychological scars are still healing. The distrust of state institutions, the preference for informal networks, the suspicion of authority, these are the legacies of a system that failed. The Soviet Union is gone, but its shadow remains. The final chapter of the Soviet economic experiment was written in the years 1989 to 1991. It was a chapter of crisis, collapse, and dissolution. It was a chapter that ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. The system that had been built on the blood and sweat of millions of people, the system that had been defended by armies and secret police, the system that had promised to create a new world, simply stopped working. And when it stopped working, no one was willing to defend it. The Soviet Union collapsed because it had no defenders. It collapsed because the people who ran it had lost faith in it. It collapsed because the people who lived under it had lost hope. The question that began this chapter, how could a system that had survived so much collapse so quickly, has been answered. The system collapsed because it was unsustainable. It collapsed because it could not deliver. It collapsed because it had no future. The 5-year plan had created a new civilization, but it was a civilization built on a foundation of sand. And when the tide came in, it washed away. The Soviet Union is no more, but the lessons of its collapse remain. The lesson is that systems that cannot adapt will die. The lesson is that promises that cannot be kept will be broken. The lesson is that the people will not endure forever. The Soviet Union collapsed because it failed its people. And in the end, that is the only reason that matters. The question of what remains after the collapse of a civilization built on a single, all-encompassing plan is not merely an economic or political one. It is a question that reaches into the very fabric of how people live, how they trust, and how they remember. The Soviet Union was not a nation that simply failed. It was a system that, for 70 years, reshaped the landscape, the economy, and the human psyche of a vast territory. When the system dissolved in December 1991, it did not vanish into thin air. It left behind a physical and psychological inheritance that continues to shape the post-communist world. The legacy of the first 5-year plan and the decades of central planning that followed is a complex mosaic of industrial ruins, environmental catastrophe, and deeply ingrained habits of survival. To understand what remains is to understand the long shadow cast by a project that aimed to create a new civilization, but, in many ways, created a new form of serfdom. The most visible legacy is the distorted industrial structure that the post-Soviet republics inherited. The Soviet economy was not designed for efficiency or consumer satisfaction. It was designed to meet the production targets set by Gosplan, the state planning committee. This led to the creation of massive, vertically integrated factories, often built in remote locations for strategic reasons. These factories were the centerpieces of entire towns, known as monotowns. A monotown was a settlement whose entire economic life depended on a single enterprise. If that enterprise was a steel mill, the town was a steel town. If it was a car factory, the town was a car town. The logic of central planning dictated that these factories be built as large as possible to achieve economies of scale, but the scale was a mirage. The factories were inefficient, technologically outdated, and dependent on a constant flow of subsidies and guaranteed orders from the state. When the Soviet Union collapsed, these factories were suddenly exposed to the brutal forces of a market economy for which they were never designed. They could not compete. The result was a wave of mass unemployment and social collapse that devastated entire regions. Consider the city of Togliatti, named after the Italian communist Palmiro Togliatti. It was built around the Avto VAZ automobile plant, which produced the iconic Lada. At its peak, Avto VAZ employed over 100,000 people and produced hundreds of thousands of cars each year. But the Lada was a relic of 1960s technology, a copy of a Fiat model that had long since been obsolete in the West. When the Soviet market opened to foreign imports, the Lada could not compete with more reliable, more modern cars from Japan, Germany, and South Korea. The plant struggled, laid off workers, and became a symbol of the rusting industrial heartland. In the 1990s, the unemployment rate in Togliatti soared, and the city experienced a surge in crime, poverty, and social despair. The same story played out across the former Soviet Union. In the Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih, the massive iron ore mining and steel production complex, Kryvyi was the lifeblood of the region. After privatization, it became a source of bitter conflict between oligarchs, and its workers faced wage arrears and layoffs. The monotowns were not just economic failures, they were human tragedies. The people who lived in them had been told for generations that their work was heroic, that they were building socialism. Now they were told they were redundant. The environmental legacy of the 5-year plans is a toxic time bomb that will require generations and billions of dollars to defuse. The Soviet obsession with production at any cost led to a systematic disregard for environmental protection. There were no environmental impact assessments, no clean air or water regulations that were enforced, and no public accountability for pollution. The result is a continent-sized scar on the Earth. The most dramatic example is the Aral Sea, once the world's 4th largest lake. In the 1960s, the Soviet government decided to divert the rivers that fed the Aral Sea to irrigate cotton fields in the arid republics of Central Asia. The plan was to turn the region into a cotton plantation for the empire. The cotton was grown, but the sea began to shrink. By 1990, it had lost 90% of its volume. The fishing industry, which had once employed 60,000 people, was destroyed. The exposed seabed became a source of toxic dust storms laced with pesticides and salt that blew across the region, causing respiratory diseases, cancer, and birth defects. The town of Moynak, once a thriving fishing port, is now a graveyard of rusting ships stranded in a desert. The Aral Sea disaster is not an accident. It is a direct consequence of the 5-year plan's logic, which treated nature as a resource to be exploited without limit. The environmental damage is not confined to Central Asia. In the Russian Arctic, the city of Norilsk is one of the most polluted places on Earth. The Norilsk nickel smelter has been pouring sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere for decades, creating an industrial wasteland where the surrounding tundra is dead. The life expectancy in Norilsk is 10 to 15 years below the national average. The soil and water are contaminated with heavy metals. The same story can be told of Magnitogorsk, the steel city built by the first 5-year plan, where the air was so thick with pollutants that it was often difficult to see across the street. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 was the ultimate expression of this systemic disregard for safety. The RBMK reactor design had known flaws, but the Soviet nuclear industry, driven by the imperative to meet production targets, refused to correct them. The explosion at reactor number 4 released a cloud of radioactive material that contaminated vast areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The cleanup has cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and the still leaking sarcophagus that covers the reactor will require maintenance for centuries. The environmental legacy of the 5-year plan is not a problem that will solve itself. It is a permanent debt that the post-Soviet states must pay. The psychological legacy of the system is perhaps the most enduring and the most difficult to measure. 70 years of central planning created a culture of survival that did not disappear when the Soviet Union collapsed. At the heart of this culture was a profound distrust of state institutions. The Soviet state, despite its propaganda of collective progress, was experienced by ordinary people as a predatory and indifferent force. It demanded obedience, it punished failure, and it offered no guarantees of fairness. In response, people developed a parallel system of informal networks to get what they needed. This system was known as Blat. Blat was the use of personal connections to obtain goods and services that were officially scarce. To get a decent medical treatment, you needed to know a doctor. To get a cut of meat, you needed to know a store clerk. To get your car repaired, you needed to know a mechanic. Blat was not corruption in the sense of bribery. It was a reciprocal exchange of favors, a social currency that everyone understood. It was a way of navigating a system that was designed to fail you. This culture of Blat did not vanish with the end of the Soviet Union. It mutated. In the chaotic years of the 1990s, when the state was weak and the rule of law was absent, the informal networks of the Soviet era became the foundation of post-Soviet capitalism. The people who had the right connections, the ones who knew how to work the system, were the ones who became the new oligarchs. They used their party connections, their access to state assets, and their knowledge of the shadow economy to amass enormous fortunes during the privatization of state enterprises. The result was a form of capitalism that was deeply intertwined with corruption and cronyism. In Russia, Ukraine, and many other post-Soviet states, the line between business and government remained blurred. The trust that is essential for a functioning market economy, trust in contracts, trust in the legal system, trust in the currency, was in short supply. People continued to rely on personal connections rather than institutions. The habit of Blat, born of necessity under communism, became a permanent feature of post-communist life. The economic legacy of the 5-year plan is not uniform across the former Soviet bloc. Some countries managed to escape the trap of the distorted industrial structure and build functioning market economies. The most successful examples are the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Poland. These countries had a crucial advantage. They had been forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union after World War II, and they had memories of a pre-communist market economy. They also had strong national identities and a deep desire to rejoin Europe. After 1991, they implemented radical reforms. They stabilized their currencies, privatized state enterprises, opened their economies to foreign trade and investment, and built new legal and regulatory frameworks. Estonia, in particular, became a model of post-communist transformation. It introduced a flat tax, embraced digital technology, and attracted significant foreign investment. By the 2000s, Estonia's economy was growing rapidly, and it had successfully integrated into the European Union. Poland followed a similar path, though with more gradual reforms. Its economy grew steadily, and it became a manufacturing hub for Western Europe. These countries demonstrated that the legacy of central planning could be overcome, but it required political will, institutional reform, and a clear break with the past. The story is different for Russia and Ukraine. Russia inherited the bulk of the Soviet industrial and military complex, and its economy was dominated by natural resource extraction, particularly oil and gas. The privatization of the 1990s was a disaster. State assets were sold off at fire sale prices to a small group of well-connected insiders who became the oligarchs. The resulting economy was characterized by extreme inequality, capital flight, and a weak state. The Russian state, under Vladimir Putin, reasserted control over the energy sector and restored a degree of stability, but it did so by recreating a form of state capitalism that bore a troubling resemblance to the Soviet system. The economy remained dependent on commodity prices, and corruption remained endemic. Ukraine's transition was even more painful. it inherited a heavily industrialized economy that was deeply integrated with Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union severed supply chains and destroyed markets. Ukraine experienced hyperinflation, a banking crisis, and a prolonged economic depression. The country was also plagued by political instability and corruption. The 2014 Euromaidan revolution was, in part, a rebellion against a system that had failed to deliver the prosperity that Ukrainians had hoped for after independence. The war with Russia that began in 2014 and escalated in 2022 has further devastated the Ukrainian economy. The legacy of the Five-Year Plan in Ukraine is a legacy of dependency, corruption, and conflict. The ideological legacy of the Five-Year Plan is a cautionary tale that continues to resonate in the 21st century. The idea of central planning, of a single, rational authority that can organize the entire economy for the common good, retains a powerful appeal. It is often invoked by advocates of state intervention, environmental activists who believe that only a planned economy can address climate change, and politicians who promise to restore a lost golden age of industrial might. But the historical record is clear. The Five-Year Plan did not produce prosperity. It did not produce justice. It produced a system that was inefficient, oppressive, and ultimately unsustainable. The Soviet economy could produce tanks and missiles, but it could not produce decent housing, reliable consumer goods, or a healthy environment. The reason was not that Soviet planners were stupid or lazy. It was that the task they set themselves was impossible. A modern economy is not a machine that can be designed and controlled from a central command center. It is a complex, adaptive system that requires decentralized decision-making, feedback from consumers, and the freedom to experiment and fail. Central planning suppressed all of these elements. It replaced the price mechanism with administrative orders, and it replaced competition with monopoly. The result was a system that could achieve simple, measurable goals, building a dam, fighting a war, launching a satellite, but failed spectacularly at the complex task of providing for the daily needs of its citizens. The lesson for the 21st century is that large-scale economic planning can work for simple, measurable goals, but it fails for complex, adaptive systems. The Soviet Union could build the world's largest hydroelectric dam, but it could not produce a reliable automobile. It could put the first man into space, but it could not produce a decent pair of shoes. This distinction is crucial for contemporary debates about the role of the state in the economy. Governments can and should set goals, provide public goods, and regulate markets, but they cannot replace markets. The attempt to do so leads not to abundance, but to scarcity, not to freedom, but to serfdom. The Five-Year Plan is a monument to this truth. The final image of this chapter is the ruins of a Soviet factory, now converted into a shopping mall. This is a common sight across the post-Soviet world. In Moscow, the former ZIL automobile plant, once a symbol of Soviet industrial might, has been redeveloped into a residential and commercial complex. In Kiev, the former Arsenal factory, which produced military equipment, now houses a shopping center and a business park. These transformations are often celebrated as symbols of the market's triumph over the failures of central planning. And in a sense, they are. The shopping mall represents consumer choice, competition, and the freedom to buy what you want. But the image is also a reminder of the human cost of both systems. The workers who built the factory, who spent their lives producing goods that were often useless, were not the ones who benefited from the transition. They lost their jobs, their pensions, and their sense of purpose. The shopping mall is a temple of consumption, but it is built on the ruins of a world that promised something more than consumption. It promised a new civilization. That promise was broken. And the people who believed in it are left to wander through the aisles of the mall, wondering what it was all for. The legacy of the first Five-Year Plan is not a single thing. It is a complex, contradictory inheritance. It is the rusting factories and the toxic wastelands. It is the culture of Blat and the distrust of institutions. It is the oligarchs and the impoverished pensioners. It is the successful transitions of the Baltic states and the ongoing struggles of Ukraine and Russia. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of utopian ambition, and a reminder that the human cost of economic systems is measured not in output statistics, but in lives lived and lost. The Soviet experiment was a grand failure, but it was not a meaningless one. It taught the world a lesson about the limits of planning, the importance of freedom, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of oppression. That lesson remains relevant today, as new forms of central planning are proposed and new utopias are imagined. The ruins of the Soviet factory are not just a relic of the past, they are a warning for the future. The question is whether we will heed it.